So my name is David Park. I'm the director of the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute. We and partners with a lot of people here, and I'm going to mention them shortly, are incredibly blessed to have all of you in this room to talk about an incredibly important area of research, an important area in society, important to all of us, and that is concussion and concussion injury. So, I just want to mention briefly about the Brain and Mind Research Institute. So, in the Ottawa area, there's incredible depth in the number of researchers spread across the hospitals and the universities and colleges to really try and figure out what's going on in the brain, what makes it tick. And the Brain and Mind Research Institute brings those people together, like for concussion injury, because it really takes a village to understand the complexity of the brain. All of us know we have 100 billion neurons and 100 trillion connections. And when it comes to concussion injury, it's about how those connections function. And sometimes you can't see the function by looking at an MRI or looking at a blood test. So with that in mind, the Brain and Mind has really come together with the Concussion Legacy Foundation, Tim. And with Gordon and Kathleen Stringer of the Rowan Legacy program to bring the community together to try in Ottawa, and this is being done across the country, in Ottawa, organize community efforts along with the scientific effort. So we have a lot of incredible people here today. They will be introduced not by me, but by others. But I just wanted to have this opportunity to thank all of you again for coming together. So I want to first introduce our host for this evening, Algonquin College, Cheryl Jensen, the president of Algonquin College, to say a few words.
Well, good evening, everyone. Bonsoir, Quay. Before I begin my remarks tonight, what a great crowd we have here tonight. I'm very, very impressed. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that this event is taking place on traditional Algonquin lands. I want to welcome you all to Algonquin College for this important conference and to congratulate the organizers for bringing us together to raise awareness about the important work that has been done and that still needs to be done around concussion and head trauma research. In particular, I want to welcome Gordon and Kathleen Stringer, MPP Lisa McLeod, and all of the professional athletes that have joined us tonight, the Concussion Legacy Foundation, members of the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee, and representatives from the University of Ottawa Brain and Mind Research Institute and the Boston University School of Medicine. I don't need to tell you how important it is that we continue to raise awareness about the sometimes devastating outcomes that can result from a concussion. You are here because you have seen firsthand that this is a public health issue and that we must all work on this collectively to raise awareness, prevent, and detect. Through meaningful exchange, discussion, and probably even a few debates, I hope you will push each other, collaborate with each other, and learn from each other's experiences and perspectives. Here at Algonquin College, we are committed to doing our part to train the next generation of frontline healthcare workers and ensure our student athletes are aware of the signs and symptoms associated with concussions. Our occupational therapist assistant and physiotherapy assistant students are working in collaboration with the Students Association to implement a concussion strategy that will see a baseline assessment completed on all student athletes prior to the start of each sports season. In addition, our occupational therapy assistant and physiotherapy assistant programs have made us the first college in Ontario to partner with the Concussion Legacy Foundation in Canada to integrate their Team Up program into our program curriculum. And so that our students can learn current best practices and protocols to share with community groups and high school athletes during their placement experiences with us. State-of-the-art equipment in our Garbarino-Gerard Center for Innovation in Seniors Care enables us in the development of competencies that prepare our learners for their future careers in rehabilitative health care. You will hear from him later, but I would be remiss if I did not mention that we at Algonquin are incredibly fortunate to have Jim Kite, the Dean of our School of Hospitality and Tourism, as an example of what can be accomplished through hard work and perseverance after a serious concussion. Jim. We know that there is still more to be done, and I look forward to hearing from all of you about how we can be a better partner in advancing the study and the treatment of brain trauma. On behalf of Algonquin College and all of our faculty, our students, and our staff, I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. I wish you a productive and a meaningful symposium. Thanks again. Merci, Miigwech.
So our first panel for the evening will be a discussion of Rowan's Law. So I'll introduce our panelists. First, in May of 2013, Gordon's daughter Rowan passed away from second impact syndrome as a result of continuing to play after suffering a head injury on the rugby pitch. Rowan was a student at John McCrae High School in Nepean. The Stringer family, her mother Kathleen, her sister Cassie, and Gord have since become national leaders in the effort to reduce head injuries in Canadian sport. They are an inspiration to us all. Our symposium today is named after Rowan and is being held in her honor. Gord, will you come up and join us? Lisa McLeod is a member of provincial parliament from the Nepean-Carleton riding. Lisa is the president of the Treasury Board. She is also a coach for her daughter Victoria's hockey team. Lisa was the driving force behind the passings of Rowan's Law, and I can say from personal experience, you want to have Lisa on your team. Lisa, you can come up. Eric Lindros. Eric is best known for his on-ice prowess in both the NHL and an international play representing Canada. He was recently inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame and is one of the greatest hockey players of all time.
Hear, hear.
What is less known is that he has been instrumental in establishing the Selah Concussion Initiative at Western University in London, Ontario, and obtaining support from the National Hockey League's Players Association for concussion research. Eric worked hand in hand with Lisa and the Stringers to make sure that Rowan's Law was passed. He then sat along with Gord on Rowan's Law Advisory Committee that released its report in September. Please welcome Eric Lindros. So we've got limited time, so let's get started. Gord, can you please tell us how losing Rowan led you to become an advocate for safer sports and what made you want to pursue Rowan's Law?
How long do I have?
3 to 4 minutes.
Well, it really started, Rowan passed away on Sunday evening, and Monday morning, at our house, the phone started ringing. And we basically spent the last 5 days in the hospital, didn't really know anything that was going on. We didn't realize that the school board had released, there'd been news about her in media, and the school board had released an item that she passed away. So really it started at that point. We were getting calls, and Kathleen and I had to make a very quick decision as to whether we were going to politely ask them to leave us to deal with our situation, or if we were going to talk about it. And we decided that we were going to talk about it. So it really started there. We talked a lot initially about her organ donation, which is still an important cause for us. For those of you who haven't signed your donor cards, please do so, or give serious consideration to doing so. But then we also started to talk more about, at that point we didn't know what exactly had happened, other than they concluded she had obviously massive brain swelling, and the doctors at Mchale suspected that she may have had previous injuries before that one, but it wasn't really known at that point. We got a call from Chris Nowinski at the Concussion Legacy Foundation asking for her brain, which kind of came out of the blue. But all of these things were happening in a matter of days. So we went out, we talked about her story whenever we were asked to, et cetera, et cetera. About a year and a half later, I got a call from the coroner's office here in Ottawa saying that Dr. Charles Tatter had requested an inquest into Rowan's death. I didn't know who Charles Tatter was at the time. I also didn't know how fortunate we were at that point that he was interested in Rowan. So I spoke to him about what his motivations were for requesting an inquest, and he said, well, I want to learn everything we can about what happened to Rowan so that we can prevent it from happening again. And that was really a door opening at that point. So we fully supported him and his request for the inquest. So in May and June of 2015, 2 years almost exactly after Rowan passed away, the inquest was held here in Ottawa. And from that inquest were 49 recommendations. And they say in life, when a door closes, another door opens. And this is what it's kind of been like for us. It's been doors closing and other ones opening. So the inquest ends. We've got 49 recommendations. I don't really know much about inquests. So I started looking into it, found out, yeah, it's nice there's recommendations that come out of an inquest, but nobody has to do anything about it. They just sit there on a shelf. And I thought, well, what are we going to do? So I thought, well, I vote for Mchale, let's go past her.
Thank God you voted for me. I'm worried.
So the door opened there. I went into her office and I introduced myself. She said, yeah, I know who you are. And I said, well, I've got 49 jury recommendations and I don't want them sitting on a shelf somewhere. So how are we going to get them looked at? So then begins the story of Rowan's Law. So basically almost exactly a year after that, we got through third reading. That door closed and another door opened with the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee being formed by the government. And that committee worked for another year. And we released our report just over a month ago. We had a commitment the very next day from the government that they're going to pursue legislation based on the report's recommendations. That's where we stand today. And that door is closed and another door is open. The law still has to be written. The follow-up to the report still has to be done. But we have events like this one that we're going to continue to push forward and support. And we want to expand across Canada to various collaborations with universities and colleges so that these kind of fora happen regularly across Canada. And we also need to push for Ontario and Rowan's Law to be an example replicated across the country in all jurisdictions. So that's the door that's open now.
So Lisa, maybe you could comment on that and talk a little bit about what the procedure has been in terms of getting Rowan's Law passed, and then telling us where do we go from here and what's next on the agenda.
Thanks very much, Tim, and thank you, Gordon, and Kathleen, who's here as well. Kathleen, just stand up and give everybody a wave, please. You're lovely. Just before I do that, it's extremely important that we're doing this here today in Nepean. I want to thank the University of Ottawa and the Concussion Leadership Foundation, or Legacy Foundation, for agreeing to do it here at Algonquin College, and for Cheryl, you to do this. I know it may not be a natural fit for some people, but Rowan was from just up the road. And her pitch isn't too far from here. Her mom and dad aren't very far from here. And I know right now we have representatives here from the Nepean Eagles, Nepean Wildcats, Nepean Barhaven Rugby Scottish, Nepean Ringette. I don't know if we have anybody, did I say Eagles? Yes, I've got Ken. I don't know if we have anybody here for basketball, but it was very important for us to be here because we're not now talking as much about Rowan's Law as we are talking about Rowan's legacy. And there might be another law named Rowan's Law, but it's going to be part of this legacy that we have here. And this event today, this inaugural event that you're all at, is very much a part of that. So let me pick up after the Stringers came to meet me in June of, I want to say, 2015. And they came to see me, and many of you know me, many of you were my constituents, but some of you may not. At that point, I was in a very private battle with depression and anxiety. And I was having a very difficult time finding purpose. And the Stringers came in to see me, and they told me that their daughter had died, which I had known, and that they wanted to pursue private members of legislation in order to bring forward changes in concussion, and how we treat them, and how we identify them, and how we actually, quite frankly, talk about them. So I said yes, without a hesitation, because I really did feel I could help. I didn't know at the time how. But it was in the September, right before we went back to the legislature, before our bill was drafted, we had well over 200 people from the athletic community in Barhaven show up and stand in the pouring rain in order to sign a petition calling for Rowan's Law. From there, it got easy because the entire city of Ottawa had been behind us, weren't they? They really were, including the media, who's not always on my side. But that was a joke. I'll not quit my day job then. But it became easier because what we have allowed to do in the Ontario legislature, but it's very rarely done, is when there's such a bill that is so uncontentious, so universally accepted, that members from all parties want to buy in. So I went to a Liberal, John Fraser, who's also from Ottawa, and my friend Catherine Fife, who's a Democrat from Kitchener-Waterloo, and I said, in order for this bill to succeed, it doesn't just have to pass for the people of Nepean, it needs to pass for the people of Ontario, and I need your help. And John was, and still is, the parliamentary assistant to the Minister of Health. So we signed that bill, we garnered momentum, we had tens of thousands of people sign the petition, and then the bill passed first reading. It passed second reading. It went into committee, and then we passed it on June 7th, 2016, and it became Canada's first concussion legislation in all of this country. So that's a tremendous feat for all of us in this room and all of us in this committee. So then board, of course, had to take it to the next level through the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee, which Eric was part of, Rosie McLennan, some other notable people. They spent a year looking at those 49 recommendations and how they could be applied throughout government, throughout sport, and throughout our school and education system. And so now what's going to happen? We are into an election year, so the timing could be interesting. I don't know if we're going to sit after Christmas or not. But the government will, and it doesn't matter which government, the government of the day will enact another Rowan's Law based on the recommendations. And so that will require the bill to be written, introduced, we will go into a debate, then we'll go into committee, and then we will go into what's called third reading, and then finally, in order for the bill to become law, the Lieutenant Governor will have to sign it. But that's the process where we're at right now, but it's been a heck of a journey, and it's brought us to people. And before you go, because you're going next, So I just wanted to point out that we got Eric Lindros involved because I coached him at a celebrity hockey game.
It's true.
Hey, what else is true? You didn't get into the Hockey Hall of Fame until I coached you.
That's also true.
It is also true! Please quote me on that, him too. So anybody has any Eric Lindros things they want to sign, I can sign them as well.
Eric, you did work closely with Gord on the Rowan's Law Advisory Committee. Can you briefly share some of the most important aspects of the report that the advisory committee submitted to Ms. McMahon, the Minister of Culture, Tourism and Sport?
I don't think you take 49 recommendations and you can do it. I mean, I could be brief here, but I'd really like to start with acknowledging just how strong Gord and Kathleen are. And they're really impressed. He's a true leader, and we're lucky as citizens of Ontario to have Gord with us. So, well, first off, you know, everything's passed and pushed forward in terms of Rowan's Law, but if there isn't any action, or if they only want to take on 50%, I don't think we've accomplished what we set out for. So, although things are in great shape, they're setting up, we really want to follow through and make sure that our solutions to the 49 recommendations that the coroner had are followed through upon. It was everything. It was, I didn't realize there were 72 different school boards, and each school board had its own concussion protocol. It was very confusing to me. There was a number of issues that we went through that we really tried to hone and pull together and bring the group into one, as opposed to having everything all spread out. Culture was another one. Some real basic stuff that you can go through in the dressing room to the concussion legacy, the team up, speak up, check around the room. Something as simple as that. Education in our school system. If we want to hit as many people as possible, and I'm using the term hit, and I shouldn't be. If we want to be able to, I could also go with best bang for the buck, but the bang doesn't work either. If we want to reach a great deal of people, it's the school system that we're going to have to go at, and we addressed that. We addressed teachers' involvement. We addressed brain week. We addressed a lot of things that are. It's not that hard to do. It just needs to be implemented. And sometimes, as we found out in this course of this year, that asking people to make changes in areas that they just hasn't been this way in the past is a bit frustrating, but I think we're making headway and we're getting through, and we had a lot of support on that board.
Yeah, speaking of solutions, you've been instrumental in creating the See the Line initiative at Western University. The work that's being done there has an impact locally, nationally, and even internationally. Can you please describe for us what See the Line is and what motivated you to get involved?
I'm from London, Ontario, and when I retired, I wanted to see better communication and better collaboration in the medical world. And a few years after helping out with a building, they gave me a phone call and said, you know, we have this idea of a concussion symposium, very similar to this, really. I mean, early stages. And you'd be a great fit because you get banged up so much. So sure, hands up, and you go down. And it's grown in so many different ways. The community really has taken hold of it. It's free. It's open to everybody. We have great, wonderful speakers that come in, trying to teach the latest and greatest of where things are at. There's also much more of a symposium for researchers to get together and collaborate the day before and the morning before the general population symposium, which is something you guys could think about here. But really, it was getting, you know, Ann McKee from Boston and the names of the names and bringing together and sharing. I think that's one thing that we haven't really been too good about, and that's sharing and collaborating. And I think that that's where this is really going to take off if that starts to stroke. So we're going to be in our 7th or 8th year next year, and it's really going well. And I think people have a lot of comfort when they see the brand, See the Line, that they know that they're coming in and hearing the real deal.
Gord, maybe continuing on that thought and talking a little bit about what you visualize here for Rowan's Legacy project here in Ottawa.
Well, I was invited last year down to see the line in London, and I'd never heard of it before. I went down there, and it was just, I was taken aback by, really for me, it was the community aspect of it. It was, there were people there, there were just coaches, teachers, players, parents, and they were all there listening, exchanging stories, learning. And that for me was what struck the chord, was that I wanted to see something like that in Ottawa. I believed that Ottawa would support it. It was just a matter of getting the pieces in place, getting the wheels turning, and getting it done. So this is what I see for this. This year we're starting, we've got an evening event. I hope that it grows. I hope that it expands every year. I hope that we can get a continuing medical education component to it, just like they have in Western. We have amazing research that goes on here in Ottawa. I mean, we've got people here tonight that are going to speak later on, Dr. Zanuck, Dr. Goulet, Dr. Park, all of these people, amazing, international, renowned. We need to promote this, we need to celebrate it, we need to learn from these people. And this is a good opportunity to do that, but also engage the community as well. And raising awareness, raising education, keeping on top of the latest and greatest that's going on here in Ottawa, but also internationally. What I've learned over the last 4 years is that Canada is an amazing place as far as research in this area goes. We've got centers of expertise all over the place that I never knew about. And people are doing amazing work. And I'd like to see some of them get invited here to present what they're doing as well, from all over the country. So this is kind of the vision that I have. We've got See the Line as what I see as an excellent model. It just needs to be replicated here and at various other centers across the country, and that's the door that's open, and I'm going through it.
Lisa, maybe you could comment quickly on, because we're running out of time here, but in terms of the legislation, in my home province of Quebec, Bill 496 was not passed. Opponents of the bill said that while the aims of the legislation were noble, they did not feel a law was required to achieve the stated goals of prevention, management, and awareness. What's your response?
Two things: seatbelts and drinking and driving. Both required legislation in order to understand that in order to cut fatalities, you need to wear your seatbelt and not drink and drive. So if we want to have a very serious conversation about preventing serious head injuries and serious and fatalities, then we actually have to bring in some forms of legislation. It doesn't mean everything needs to be legislated, and the initial Rowan's Law didn't mean that everything needed to be legislated. In fact, some of the things that Eric and Gord and many others here are talking about won't require legislation. They will require at the school board level regulatory changes. They will require funding for our researchers and for treatment. It will require advertising dollars, none of which needs to be legislated. But some things do require legislation. And that's where it is required. And I think that's why we're proud of the work we've done in Ontario. If you think about it, every single jurisdiction in the United States has some form or other of concussion legislation. And I like to think that we are far ahead of the United States on virtually everything on the planet. So, that's not on tape, is it? I'm actually calling it myself. He'll snip it, that's great, that's what I like. So I think that's what's important, and that's why Eric and I wrote an open letter to all of the ministers of health, the ministers of sport. I think it was a year ago, was it, Gord? We wrote this open letter, was published here. We also sent, Tim and myself and others sent another open letter encouraging other governments across the nation to deal with this. Why? Our kids travel. Our kids just don't play hockey, soccer, ringette, basketball, football in the province of Ontario. They may go to schools and universities and colleges outside of our jurisdiction. We want to protect them. We want to keep them safe. We want to make sure that if they have a head injury in Nova Scotia, that it's recorded back here in the province of Ontario, or at least it's being taken care of. And that's why we need it. And I just really remiss and maybe want to introduce some of the players that are here today. But we, have some minor youth sports here, which is incredible. But what I think Tim Fleischer has done, and he's done an incredible job, is he has brought pro athletes to the table. And when it comes to our kids, and this doesn't require legislation either, they need to be able to look up to an Eric Lindros or a Connor Williams and say, if they took themselves out of play, then I can too. And Eric did the best line at one of our press conferences ever. It was about ringette. Do you remember it? There's like a
you have to look at it in the eyes of the kid is 14 years old and they're going to miss a playoff game. You have to, and they perceive it to be their Stanley Cup. That was the gist of it. Yeah. So concussions are, I think, 30% are athletic related. 70% are not. I mean, this isn't athletics.
ER room, right?
Pardon?
Of the ER room?
In the emergency room, 65% are sports, but again, even
in the ER room, but overall in general, concussions, 100%, 30% are sports related, 70% are playing, being at the school, fall downs, slip and falls, car accidents, so on and so forth. So this isn't just about sports or athletics. This is about everybody, really. Getting people better awareness, getting them to understand that there will be a dip, but generally things will come back together. I wish we had better results from our research to say that things are moving in a great way, but the protocols that occurred in the 90s when I went through, that I had when I went through my concussions are very similar to what we have now. And it would be great, moving forward if those there were some leaps and bounds, and we're making great headway.
And Eric, just to follow up on that, what role do professional sports team and leagues need to play in the solution?
Oh, that would be great, but it's, geez, I wouldn't rely on them, put it that way. It would be great if they could come out and lead. I look at the NHL, and if they gave $1, I would consider that to be equivalent of 4 with the brand that they have and the influence that they have. But the league is in a tough situation, it feels, with the lawsuit that former players have brought against them, and that business element to things is causing a problem. So I think we go the other way and deal with the education working its way up and grow the culture from the grassroots.
Gordon, I'll give you the last word here. Do you think children should be participating in sports like soccer and football and hockey and rugby?
We have never made this about demonizing sport. The obvious answer would be, for me, yes. Or I should say, no, they shouldn't be. If Rowan didn't play the sports she was playing, she might still be here. But that's not what I feel. Sport is so important in so many ways. It's part of a healthy lifestyle. It teaches teamwork. It teaches time management. It teaches collaboration. There's so much that you learn from sport that I would say, yes, they do need to play sport. What I will say is, I think there are sports out there that need to look inward and make some changes, particularly for the kids. Hockey's doing a pretty good job, I think, at the minor league level. I think they need to seriously consider upping the age for body checking a little more, based on what I've seen. Football has some soul searching to do, I believe. But I also believe that there are people in those sports that are recognizing the problem, particularly at the grassroots level, and are taking necessary steps with protocols, with coaching requirements, educating their players and their parents to be more cognizant of head injury and what can happen. I was very disappointed about the story that came out of New Brunswick over the weekend, where 9 football players were removed from a game by halftime with head injuries. I found it very hard to believe that somebody didn't see that something was going incredibly wrong in that game. But you know, that generally is the exception, but those are the stories that get the press. And I'm sure that the football folks are going to be looking at that and go, yeah, we don't need another story like that. So, yes, I do believe kids should be active in sports. I believe that sports have a responsibility to make player welfare the priority.
Very good. Lisa, Eric, Gordon, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tim, Gordon, Eric, and Lisa. Okay, so I just wanted to continue by echoing what Eric had said, and that is concussion affects us all. And of course, our children are incredibly important. Of course, sports is incredibly important. But I cannot tell you how many people have come to me, how many people have come to the Brain and Mind, how many people have come to the concussion injury group, of all ages and from every walks of life, having just tripped on some ice and having their lives change forever. So it affects us all, and so because of that theme, we want to go next to the idea of all of us, whether it be children, whether it be adults. What do we do? What do we have to look at? What are maybe a summary of the current treatments and what's known about concussion injury? Because it doesn't affect everyone the same way. So to do this, we're going to have a panel, and I'd like to introduce the moderator, Anna Karina Tebenor. She is kindly doing this for the second year for us. She is an amazing veteran broadcast journalist and communication strategist, having worked for CBC, CTV. She's host and contributing editor of Canada in Perspective. Anna, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, David. I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Gordon and Nancy, for taking us on this journey. And we're all here, like you said, like Lisa was saying, for Rowan's legacy and to help grow it the way you see it. And so my job now is to switch gears and give all of you some practical information. And I would like to call on stage 2 gentlemen who I'm sure you're both very familiar with. They are world-renowned experts in the field of brain trauma, concussion prevention, and treatment. So please welcome Dr. Sean Marshall with the Ottawa Rehabilitation Centre. And his colleague, Dr. Christian Goulet with the Mchale Concussion Clinic. Thank you, gentlemen. I really appreciate the work that you do as a parent of 3 people, 3 children, 3 teenagers who are in competitive sports. So for the other parents and all the other people out there, how do you recognize a concussion?
I just take a step back a minute, and I just want to thank again what's been said, but first, thank Kathleen and Gordon. I think, we wouldn't be here, without their strength, and then you have Lisa McLeod, too, we wouldn't be here without her preservation, and then I think guys like Tim and Eric, too, with, bringing their awareness. I'll tell you a quick story about my connection with Eric Lindros. So my father was a scout for the Capitals, and I remember I was probably 9 years old, and we went and we saw Eric when he was playing for the Generals. I think when, he was like 15, and I remember my dad saying, watch this Eric Lindros guy, he's going to be good. So he's going to be #1 overall pick. And if Lisa can take credit for getting her in the Hall of Fame, then the Goulet should get credit for getting her. But anyway, so when you look at the signs and symptoms of a concussion, the first thing that you have to realize is that it is a brain injury, right? And brain injuries present in different ways in different people. So the way that I always explain things is if someone has a significant head injury and there's any sort of change in how their brain works, and that means, does it create headaches, does it create dizziness, does it create a change in their emotions, then it's a concussion, it's a proven otherwise. And I think that's kind of a standard to live by, is that, well, doesn't necessarily mean it's concussion, because there's a lot of things that give you dizziness and give you headaches and emotion, but if there's a form of trauma associated with it, it doesn't have to be a hit to the head, which is what a lot of people don't understand, and certainly there doesn't have to be a loss of consciousness, but if there's any sort of trauma where it causes a head to move, developing symptoms, it's a concussion until proven otherwise, and it should be proven otherwise by a qualified medical professional.
Okay, Dr. Sean Marshall, tell us what happens to the brain when there is a concussion?
Am I on? Great. What happens to the brain when you're concussion? So concussion is forced to the brain, and it's an injury. The brain is an organ, and when you injure it, it doesn't function well. And it's actually sensitive to trauma. The brain, I think, as David Parkwell described, is composed of neurons, axons, connections, and there's dysfunction when you injure it. Just like you injure your leg or your knee, there's an injury response. And when that occurs, function's impaired. It needs to be assessed, just as Dr. Goulet was saying, and it needs to be monitored and respected. But what happens is when these connections occur, it can be a myriad of symptoms that present. And everyone will say they present with headache, but we see decreased function. So clearly we see people who have difficulties with focus, attention, and concentration. We see people with increased symptoms in their even emotions and behavior in their response early on. The brain runs all of these things. And even things like visual tracking, balance, all of these things are commonly affected in common symptoms like concussion because they're run by the brain.
So you mentioned behavioral emotional changes. What kind of changes should we be looking out for?
Well, I think that many people, after concussion, behavioral emotional responses, I think there can be heightened response emotions. There can be irritability, which is a very common symptom following concussion, so decreased tolerance to stress and external stimuli. So these are things that patients will notice, and again, we expect will typically recover following concussion, but symptoms can persist, and every individual who has experienced trauma and a concussion has a different experience and a different response. Circumstances are different. You've been in a sporting event versus a motor vehicle collision, forces are different, and how your body responds to that is different.
Yeah, and so can you address the fact that we have some patients who may have a concussion and then they're able to function afterward, and yet you have other patients who have ongoing symptoms a long time after the incident.
So, and I think there's a big difference. It's important to realize that you have concussion, which is one thing, and then you have post-concussion syndrome, which definitely is related to concussion, but it's almost apples and oranges, it's completely different. And I think what people have to realize is that concussions are not just a brain injury, but truly, scientifically, it's a full body reaction, right? And for people to get fully better, you have to treat not only the brain, but you have to treat the mind as well, right? And the body. And I think so I love the title of the uOttawa, Brain and Mind, right? People just say, well, brain and mind, same thing, not completely different, right? So when you're treating a concussion, not only do you treat the brain, so kind of all that squishy tissue you have in there, but you treat the mind and how all that squishy tissue actually works. And when you optimize treatment both of the brain and of the mind, that's when you get a full recovery.
Okay, so let's dig deeper. You've spoken about treatment. What's the current protocol for treatment?
Well, we've known for a while now, and I think finally the word is getting out there that cocoon therapy doesn't work, right?
Cocoon therapy, what does that mean?
So you put someone in a dark room, right? Say, you don't do anything, don't go to school, don't go outside, lock the door, slide food under the door, right? That doesn't work. Because when you feel sick, you stay sick, right? We got to try to get people slowly, gradually back to life, right? Dr. Zemek's doing some good research about trying to figure out when is the exact time you can start getting people physically active. But we know that physical activity, whether you have a concussion or not, is very good for your brain. right? So part of it is not making sure kids don't feel sick, making sure that they feel that their brain is strong. I mean, I always talk about concussions being like the ocean, right? You have to respect the ocean, but you can't be terrified of the ocean too. It's the same thing with head injury. You have to respect head injury, but you can't be terrified of it either, because sometimes that fear can be almost as bad as the head trauma itself.
Okay, so Sean, does this reflect a change in the way that we've been treating concussions in the past?
There's been a lot of change in how we treat concussion in the past, and some of us have been around. The numbers in this room have been around before concussion was even frankly recognized. And the way we treat it and approach it has changed. And I think that initially, the focus being on sport, it was logical, one, to not return to sport until you've had complete recovery. I think that got changed to kind of full rest, no effort, no energy. And I think that we're balancing it to, as Christine was saying, to activity as tolerated and building up, and not allowing our bodies to recover following the concussion. So not complete rest. I do see patients who have been informed, do nothing, dark room. Certainly we do see that. There's not a consistency of message out there.
Speaking of dark room.
But I think that things have changed and they have evolved. And I go back really in my career when bed rest was for persons with low back pain, they'd say stay in bed until your back was improved. And I can tell you that that was believed to be the case. What do we know now? We know that's probably one of the worst things you can do. It has to be activity as tolerated, and then you have to define what does tolerated mean. It means don't exert yourself past the point of developing ongoing symptoms. Don't harm your recovery. And if we think of it in a physical light, pushing it to bringing it up to the point where you're active and you're progressing, but not to aggravate or make symptoms worse, I think is what we're trying to call activity.
So it seems that all of this is very, the patient is, you have to do this on an individual basis, but do you have any firm guidelines that you can tell everybody right across the board, don't do A, B, and C?
I mean, the biggest thing is that, and this is whether you start physical activity day 1 or day 8, whatever it is, but you cannot do anything that puts your head at an appreciable risk of getting hit again, and that's where the second impact syndrome comes. If you still have a concussion, which is basically, it's not post-concussion syndrome, right? There's a distinction. But if you have a concussion, meaning that there's chemicals in your brains that have been released from the trauma, and you get hit again, right? It's not a 1 hit plus 1 hit equals 2, it's a 1 hit plus 1 hit equals 10, and the whole brain starts to swell, right? And that's the thing that we have to avoid, where we just don't have that repeat injury.
Okay, so when you said 1 hit plus 1 hit equals 10, is that to say that the impact of the symptoms are tenfold?
Don't quote me on tenfold, but it definitely, there's an exponential increase in the potential for damage, yeah.
Okay, now you also talked about post-concussion syndrome. Tell me a little bit about that, please.
Sure. So everyone has symptoms following a concussion. Like how we define it, and it's a constellation of symptoms. I think as Eric Lindros was pointing out, it'd be nice to have a simple test that says, hey, you've got a concussion. So you do an x-ray, you've got a broken wrist, you've got a broken wrist. We don't have that. We go by symptoms. We do an interview, you check out, you look for neurological signs. One of the key things you're looking for, honestly, when you're doing that neurological exam is making sure it's not something more serious, meaning a moderate severe brain injury, which might need other types of interventions. I mean serious, meaning it might need surgical intervention, and that's part of my practice with moderate severe brain injury. The vast majority of concussions is the way they present. What do we know then about post-concussion syndrome? Symptoms tend to improve. If we injure our bodies, most times our body helps us with regards to recovery if we treat it correctly. I think that's what Christiane was going on about. You're vulnerable to re-injury after you've had a concussion early on. There's inflammation in the brain. There's actually markers that we can see that they're serious enough. Okay, they're not good enough to provide diagnosis. But we can't repeat the injury, and that's the number one rule. Don't have another head injury right after concussion. Let things heal. Persisting symptoms. They talk about post-concussion syndrome. What we do know is there are a constellation of symptoms that can persist. If you're on, two things will happen. Most people get better. If you sprain your ankle, in many instances, it will tend to improve. Some people have a prolonged course of that, unfortunately. With a concussion, there's a subgroup of people with ongoing symptoms, and these become persistent symptoms. And probably beyond the time frame of 3-4 weeks, after your injury, if these symptoms are persisting, you're probably looking at specialized care, or looking at trying to address those symptoms. Again, focusing on, I guess, mind and body, looking at the factors that are perpetuating this, and are there things that we can do to intervene to help do this. Is the research solid on this? It's not. We are looking at solutions, strategies to do it, and we use typically a symptom-based approach. A number of us in this room have been involved in the development of guidelines, trying to guide and standardize care. That's what a guideline does. It tries to make us all on the same page. Probably a number of you have experienced going to a lawyer, or going to your physician, or going to your accountant, and getting different opinions. Guidelines and standardization of care is a goal, and I think one of the reasons that we're here today is to try and get the message, get consistency of care, and new research comes to light to guide that, and that's what we want to get out the message. Ironically, with physicians, just with every other profession, there's not always consistency of messaging of how to manage things. I think that's part of an event like this, and I think they were commenting earlier about CME, continuing medical education, is good. CV Align does that. I've been at that event, and Christine's also impressed. You're getting some power out there by people such as Lindros stepping up. At the same time, having an event where physicians, clinicians, healthcare professionals can show up to get educated with consistency in messaging and how to manage things. And that's an opportunity, because if we look at what physicians have to know, they have to know a lot of other things too, not just concussion, unless that's all we treat every day.
Yes, thank you for that. We heard earlier, you were talking about treatment, brain, mind, a holistic treatment. Can you elaborate?
Well, when someone has a concussion, there's a huge physiological stress on the body, right? And to get down, to decrease that physiological stress, you have to basically look at every part of their body, every part of their world, right? So some things that we do when we start is, all right, we'll start at the basis, all right? You gotta make sure that you're eating well, you gotta make sure that you're sleeping well, you gotta make sure that you're drinking well, and you gotta make sure that, in my case, is that the school walls, right, aren't coming in on you, right? When that body feels threatened, or that body isn't optimizing how you're eating and you're drinking, it's very, very hard for your brain to recover. Your brain recovers best when it's at peace. And so what we try to do the most is, again, help control pain, right? We try to get them to sleep well, drink well. We try to identify any other treatment options out there, whether it's working on the neck or working on the jaw, these kind of things. And I think there's a lot of contention now about, all right, who should lead concussion management? And I always say I think you do need an MD that's trained in it to try to determine, all right, does your neck need a little bit of treatment? Instead of having someone that gets paid to treat necks, right, to say, yeah, I think you need some neck treatment, right? So it's trying to find someone a little more impartial to identify all the factors that go into recovery. So think about what the symptoms of concussion are. There's going to be a lot of things that influence your energy levels, how you think, how you feel, how your neck pain back. There's a lot of factors that go into it, and you need to take a step back and say, all right, let's identify every piece, right? And then when you start doing that, instead of just focusing on the neck, or just focusing on school, or just focusing on one thing, it's really a holistic approach.
Yeah, and it's not so straightforward. It's very complex. And this reminds me of the latest concussion that my teenager was dealing with. So you're talking about post-concussion. We noticed a dramatic change emotionally. She was very irritable, but we thought it was just teenage hormones. So how do you make that distinction? When do you know that it's not just regular teenage behavior, and it's more? I can lend you a teenager or two if you'd like to study.
Don't worry. So, if you look at the sign, the problem is you look at the signs and symptoms of concussion, right? Headache, irritability, tiredness, right? Some sensitivity to light, maybe some neck pain, some dizziness. Are those signs and symptoms of concussion? Well, they're absolutely, but there's signs and symptoms of me after a 12-hour day in clinic, right? So I feel, honestly, if you look at the diagnostic criteria, I have post-concussion syndrome every day. It's because my body is under a great deal of physiological stress every day. So when you talk about concussions, remember, concussions are chemicals, right? It's a chemical imbalance. And concussion, the symptoms aren't going to be random, right? When something is driven by chemicals, which a concussion is, right? And when patients come to see me, I always tell them that my artistic ability peaked when I was about 4 years old, but I draw what a concussion is because we know what a concussion is. We know the chemicals involved. And we know that our brains, arguably, roughly 70 million years old. So we know that the brain does have a good capability of repair. Now, you start losing that repair the more that you get hit, and so that's why we have to limit concussions. And I know I'm kind of getting off on a tangent, but we do have to change body contact levels, right? We do have to limit contact to the head, but our brains are resilient. No, I digress, don't bring it back to your question, right? So when you look at concussions, you're looking for an exertionally based symptom.
An exertionally based
Yeah, so you think too much, you run too much, and it brings on symptoms. And it's driven by chemicals, and again, chemicals aren't random. So if you can do an activity, 4, 5, 6, 7 days in a row, and then that 8th day you do the same activity, and it creates an incredible headache, as long as the activity level is about normal, then that headache that came on that 8th day, probably not a concussion, right? It could be you didn't sleep well the night before, you were dehydrated, you didn't eat well, you had a very stressful day, whatever it is.
So you mentioned the 8th day. Is 8 days?
Oh my goodness, you're a stickler for these numbers and everything. No. This is, there is no magic number, right? It's just, 4, 5, 6, 12, 15 days. What you're looking for is reproducibility and consistency, right, in the symptoms. And when you find that, yeah, I can exercise 20 minutes today and I feel good, tomorrow I can do 22 minutes, next day I can do 25 minutes, right? That's the kind of reproducibility that you're looking for.
Okay, and so...
watch what I say, but
So if someone has had a concussion, they try to do this reproducibility, but then by day 7 or day 8, it's not happening. They can't do the 20 minutes. They're feeling it again. Do they pull back all the way? What do you suggest, Sean?
No, I don't think you pull back all the way. You pull back, again, you're talking about activities tolerated. And we're within thresholds. And you even know that people don't all have the same day every day. And when you're looking at activities tolerated, you probably pull back a little bit, but you want to keep the momentum going forward. And the truth is that I asked we're able to go to work when we're sick. We're not supposed to, but we do. And it won't be as good a day. There's a threshold. And when you're recovering from something, you're taking it that level. And if it was an orthopedic injury, an ankle, you do the same thing. You say, okay, I overdid it, or something went a bit wrong, but you wouldn't just stop. You'd actually say, okay, that was too much, I'll pull it back a bit, but move towards progression. And understand that you're in this process of recovery. There's nothing wrong with that. Don't become demoralized by it, but move ahead, push back. And that's why we use the term activities tolerated, taking the point where you're not impeding recovery, but you're facilitating recovery.
And on that note, for those patients who are currently recovering from concussion, there are gains that can be made, even in the long term, even months, sometimes years after.
That's what I tell patients too. I mean, before here I was at Harvard, where the first day at the concussion clinic there, the head guy says that concussions are in a constant, perpetual state of repair, right? And it just gives you in mind that from a chemical standpoint, the concussion, your brain is always trying to fix it, right? But there are a lot of other factors that influence on how your brain recovers. When we talk about pushing forward, when I talk to patients, it's all about pacing, right? So physically, we know it takes about it's not fair, right? It takes 2 weeks to become deconditioned physically, arguably 6 weeks to get it back, right? So when you get a lot of decondition from a head injury, whether they're not thinking very well, they're not moving very well, there's gonna be some extreme deconditioning that goes on, both physically, mentally, and emotionally. So whenever you're starting to push forward, you gotta pace. And it's just baby steps, whatever you do. It's just pushing, like Sean was saying, pushing it slowly, always trying to get that momentum. And the way that I look at things that really tire the body, and this is how I explain to patients. Well, you have your physical exertion. So not only is that how much physically you move around, but how you eat, how you slept, how you drink, right? Those are physical stressors on you. Then you talk about the cognitive load, right? So how much thinking that you do, right? Did you have a lot of exams that day, a lot of cramming? And then it's almost the emotional exertion as well, and that's as equally fatiguing as anything else. How overwhelmed do you feel? How stressed, how angry, how irritable have you gotten? All those things tire the body. So yeah, there'll be some days where you might be able to run 20 minutes and feel pretty good, right? But if you have 2 exams right that day, and you might not be able to run that 20 minutes. So it's a balancing act. Just going, I love that word momentum, try to get that momentum going, right? Knowing that there's gonna be ups and downs, but knowing that your brain is strong, knowing that you can recover from this, you just can't keep getting hit in the head, right? And eventually, if your body's at peace, you can start showing gradual, consistent improvement. And I believe that. I've done this 4,000 times now. That's what I see.
Well, thank you for that encouraging news. And gentlemen, on that note, I'll have to end this panel for time. Dr. Christian Coulet and Dr. Sean Marshall, thank you so much.
Before I introduce the next speaker, Roger Zemek, I just want to make the point that as director of the Brain and Mind Research Institute, I look over a dozen different conditions, ranging all the way from Alzheimer's to MS to Parkinson's, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating and incredibly daunting to realize that when I look at how patients actually receive treatments for concussions, it is, in my opinion, the most challenging delivery system to be developed for patients, any patient group. It's incredibly fragmented. This was brought to my attention, and I mentioned this, only because community members in Ottawa are incredibly dedicated to improving the system, improving research, looking for markers of concussion, trying to figure out what happens to the brain, not just generically, but specifically, what are the biochemical processes that happen, and can we target those? Can we improve the plasticity of the brain? So these are all really incredible questions. The person that actually introduced me to that was Jane Clark over there. So Jane, can you stand up? I will tell you, as director of the Brain and Mind, I have priorities. There are a lot of things pulling at me, and concussion would not have been one of my priorities if it weren't for her and me talking. And I made a deal with her, and the deal was, you bring me all sorts of community members that will support concussion injury, I'll bring you the researchers and the docs, and that's what happened. And then we met Tim, then we met Gordon and Kathleen. So a combination of legislation, community involvement, research, clinicians, this is what's required. So on that note, I'd like to introduce you to Roger Zemek. We're incredibly fortunate to have him. He is a concussion injury expert at CHIO Research Institute and part of the Brain and Mind Research Institute. Roger, I'll let you speak.
So thank you again to the Brain and Mind Institute, to the Stringers, to everyone who brought us together tonight. This is such an important topic to talk about, and it's my honor to be with you here tonight. So I have a few things that I want people to be able to leave here with. One, identify what factors people may have that may identify what their risk is of having prolonged symptoms. Two, we talked a lot about the fact that we need research. What does the research say with regards to how people can get back to living the lives that they should be living, doing the things they want, need, and love to do? And finally, we're going to talk about what these guidelines, as Dr. Marshall mentioned, what are the latest guidelines saying? So, how many of you in this audience have had a concussion? Raise your hands. So I'd say most of us. So it's a thing that affects so many of us in so many different ways. It's also an incredibly common problem. I don't want to go into too much details of the definition, because I think Dr. Goulet and Dr. Marshall talked about it before. But again, a concussion affects the brain, you don't have to lose consciousness. How common is concussion though? One of the things that we've been trying to do is quantify how common is this problem. I'm a pediatric emergency doctor. I see patients that come to our CHIO local emergency department. And at CHIO, we see about 1,000 concussions a year. So you think about that, there's 365 days a year. So 3 kids a day on average are coming up to see someone at CHIO in emergency who are due to concussion. And this is not a problem unique to just Ottawa. If you look at these graphs, this talks about the number of concussions occurring that have been presented over the last decade. And you can see the rates of concussion visits to emergency departments and family medicine's office in pediatrics, this is between 5 and 18 years old, has quadrupled. Do I think there's people getting 4 times more concussions? No. I think we're doing a better job recognizing it. and the great job with the media and some of the silver linings of these horrific, tragic stories have increased the awareness, and people are now seeking the medical attention that they need. One of the reasons for the jump, you can see in 2011, the number went from an average number and almost doubled just in 1 year. And it wasn't necessarily a change in how we diagnose it or a change in when we code it when we present to the emergency department, but it was a high-profile person. And I think most of us in Canada know who that is, and he missed the playoffs that year because of the concussion. And that silver lining of his injury really increased awareness. Concussion impacts all of us in so many different ways. What I want to emphasize is that 1 in 5 Canadians, based on just surveys, say they've suffered a concussion in their life. That's a massive problem and something we need to do more research on to better answer the key questions that we need to answer. And I thought I would answer some key questions based on what a typical case vignette that I see in the emergency department every time I work and see a child with concussion. And I thought I'd go over a hypothetical example. This is not a real life patient, but one that's based on a hypothetical patient. So let's say there's a 14-year-old girl who had a soccer collision. She never lost consciousness. She remembers what happened, so she doesn't have what we call amnesia. She was unsteady on her feet when you evaluate her. She was slow to answer questions. She has a headache and feel foggy. And thank goodness there's a new Rowan's Law in place that their coaches and her team pulled her off from that field and made her go get medical attention and didn't let her keep playing. And so she comes to the emergency department to get seen, and you find out that she's getting worse with the noises and the lights. But she doesn't have a prior concussion. This was the first one she's ever had in her life. She has no history of migraines. We do some cognitive testing. Cognitive is like a thinking game, so we have her do some numbers backwards and she can remember them well. We have her know the days of the week, what month it is. She's able to remember a string of words. She does well. But when you do her balance testing, she has some problems. So we diagnose her with a concussion. Again, you don't need a picture, you don't need a blood test. It's based, as Dr. Marshall said, on symptoms. Parents are going to ask me 2 questions, always. First question, when is she going to get better? Is it going to be a week, a couple weeks, a couple months? And the second question is, when can she get back doing the things she wants, needs, and loves to do? And so let's talk for the remaining 10 minutes or 15 minutes before our break about what does the research say about how we can answer these 2 issues. So, I'm going to ask you, you just heard her story. She never lost consciousness. Parents are asking, when's she going to get better? What is her risk of having prolonged symptoms? Let's define that as 1 more or longer. How many, by show of hands, think she's at low risk for having symptoms last a month or more? And how many of you think she's at medium risk? And how many of you think she's at high risk? So, when I was trying to answer these questions to parents, but just 4 or 5 years ago, I didn't know the answer. So one of the things that we did was we wanted to try to answer that question. I could not predict how long the symptoms were going to last. So I made it my mission, and I have some of my research team over there, who I say but if we did this as a team to try to answer some of these questions. So I'm not going to belabor this because it was already talked about at the previous panel, but concussion can cause a constellation of symptoms across physical, emotional, sleep, all these domains, and of course the cognitive or mental changes that happen as well. And unfortunately, in some people, these symptoms last for a month or more. And when that happens, we call it persistent post-concussive symptoms. Why is this important? Why is having symptoms for 1 month or more important? Well, I think any of you who raise your hand and know what it's like to be in those symptoms that's lasting a month or more, it really impacts your quality of life. And now we actually have the science to prove it. I'm going to be showing you the results of the largest concussion study done to date, which was led by Mchale. One of the sub-studies of this bigger study was we looked at the quality of life of the 3,000 kids that we studied with concussion. And if you look, there's a few things I just want to quickly highlight. The first bar is the bar in blue, is those are the children's quality of life who had a concussion but got better within a month. And the lines in orange are the kids who had concussion but their symptoms lasted beyond a month. And there's a little solid horizontal line, which is the average child who never had the concussion. And as you can see very quickly, even from the back of the room, the kids whose symptoms persist have significantly lower quality of life as pertaining to their physical quality of life, their emotional quality of life, their social quality of life, and especially their school. And what's most worrisome is the children, even who report by 1 month feeling better, again, just this is 1 month, these markers are 1 month, 2 months, and 3 months post-injury. The kids who even have fully recovered their symptoms by a month are still having school problems at 2 months and 3 months beyond, even though they say they're back to normal. So this is a problem that we need to sort out and we need to solve, and that's why we need to be able to predict so we can do something about it early. So why, again, why can predicting how long symptoms last make a difference? Well, you can give them parents some realistic and patients some realistic information. When you go to a doctor and you say how long something lasts, and they say, I don't know, that's not very helpful. If you go and they say, well, we think it's going to last this long, at least you can start preparing yourself to start making some changes. Second, it allows us to target. So if I know from the beginning of patients at high risk, I can send them to Dr. Goulet or Dr. Marshall, get them into the clinics early, or we can begin these novel treatments to intervene to prevent these symptoms from going longer. So that was the goal of our study. Their study is called the 5P study. It stands for Predicting Persistent Post-Concussive Problems in Pediatrics. We'll call it 5P from now on. And what we did, we wanted to see who can we predict these symptoms lasting for. It was a national study, 9 centers across Canada. Ottawa was the lead site, and Candice can raise her hand, I'll put her on the spot. She was the national coordinator, so I am indebted to her for all her great work on this study as well. And what did we do? We collected a bunch of information on these kids. These kids presented to the emergency room between 5 and 18, up to 18 years old, and they presented within hours of their injury. I'll show you in a slide in a moment. The average time from their injury to when they got enrolled in this study was less than 3 hours. That's right away. This is not enrolling kids a month later and asking if their symptoms are going to last 2 months. It's kids within hours, and are their symptoms going to last a month or more? And we asked them a constellation of symptoms, and this is just an example of some of the symptom inventory that we asked. We asked them, well, how are you feeling now, and how did you feel before? Because it's really important. As Christian said, if I asked all of you right now, how many of you are feeling irritable, or those of you who have teenagers, how many of your teenagers are feeling irritable, or a bit having a headache, or a bit run down, or a bit more emotional? There'd be a lot of that, but we want to compare it to their pre-injury self. Now I know you've been hearing a lot of talks, so it's time for everyone to stand up. This is going to just take 20 seconds, but I want to show you one of the tests. We did a whole bunch of tests in the emergency room. We did about 70 different tests on these children, checking their memory, checking their functioning. One of the things we tested was their balance. Now, there's 2 tests we're going to do, as I'm going to explain it. Start with the picture on the left. You're going to put your hands on your hips, your feet together. You're going to look forward, and then you're going to close your eyes. And this is the practice one, so everyone start. This is normally, we'd be evaluating this. What you're looking for is, do you take your hands off your hips? Do you move your arm off your hip? Do you take a step? Do you open your eyes? That's a failure. This test isn't so hard. Time to open your eyes now, and everyone's going to do the second test. Pretend there's a little soccer ball in front of you and give it a kick. Pretend you are now walking a tightrope. Not a balance beam that's wide, but a tightrope, truly on that line. And same thing, hands on those hips, eyes closed. And now you're trying to see, do you take a step? Do you slide? Now those of you wearing heels, this is going to be hard. Those of you wearing ski boots, this is very easy. Ideally it's done barefootedly. So you can all have a seat again, but this is a balance test that we do. And it takes 20 seconds to evaluate. But I'll talk about why this is important. So let me just summarize the results. I know there are some scientists in the audience, but there's also plenty of people who are not scientists, so I don't want to focus on the math. But let's talk about the big picture results. This just shows you we got a lot of kids. We screened about 8,000 kids total, and we enrolled about 3,000 of them. That took a long time, a lot of effort, and a lot of hard work. But of those 3,000 kids, we followed them up, and we followed them up at 1 week, and 2 weeks, and 4 weeks, and 8 weeks, and 12 weeks, and they told us how they were doing, and we did lots of different evaluations to see how they recovered. And as I mentioned, this was a pediatric study. Most of the kids were about 8 years old, and just under half were girls. Most of them were presenting with their first concussion. There were some that had lots of concussions already, but most presented with their first. How common did it happen that children's symptoms lasted for more than a month? Well, about 30% still had symptoms of 3 or more at 1 month. So this is a problem. We have to be able to predict it. What are we going to do about it? Well, I showed you that case. Let's go over quickly what her score was. Let's apply it in real life. Of the 70 different things we looked at, if we looked at them one at a time, there were 47 of them that were significant. But it's not how do 47 things work on their own, it's how do these things work together. And of working together, it broke down to 5 main categories. So one is demographics, how old you are, and if you're boy or girl. Second, if you had, not how many concussions you had, but how long did your previous concussion last? And did you have a history of migraines? So the second category is your past history. The third category is a quick cognitive test. So even though we tested a lot of things, it was how well did they answer questions slowly? That was important. Next, how do they do on that balance test? The one that people I heard someone say, oh boy, when they said, that's a test. If you just had a concussion, you may actually have a hard time doing that. So that was a predictor. And then of all the symptoms, I listed them all that we checked for, it was these 3 main ones that made a difference. Their headache, sensitivity to noise, or fatigue. And you assign points based on their risk. And a few things I want to emphasize. Girls are more than twice the risk of boys. So let's go over this hypothetical case. You get higher points, the more high your risk is. So let's apply the rule. It's a teenage girl. 2 points for being female, 2 points for being teenager. She's had no prior concussions, no history of migraines, but she answered questions slowly, had problems in the balance testing, and then had the same constellations of symptoms that put you at high risk. And when you add up her points, she was 10 points. So although many of you may have thought she was low risk because she didn't have some of the quote-unquote classic signs, she's actually at high risk for having symptoms that last a long time. So what do we do with this? If anyone wants to read this, we published this study in JAMA. But what do we do now? I know she's high risk. What does that mean? Well, it means often people show up to my emergency room, I say you rest, parents interpret this as it was inferred that home jail. We have to do better. So let's talk about what can we do better. So we need to address this other issue. So when you look at rest, there are 2 types of rest. There's thinking rest and there's physical rest. And a lot of the protocols say, you know what, symptom-free before you get back to doing anything. But I just showed you, some people, about 1/3 of them, have a month before they're feeling better. We cannot have people not getting back to their lives for a whole month. Now, as Christian, Dr. Goulet said so correctly before, it can't be extremes. It can't be Goldilocks where it's too hot or too cold. They cannot be going back to play in 2 days and putting their brain at risk of another injury. Nor should they be in bed. What's the right answer? And as we know, as Sean said, back pain, rest is bad. Well, if you had a stroke, which is a severe brain injury where there's bleeding in the brain, your doctors get you up and begin physical rehabilitation as soon as possible. They don't wait till you are symptom-free to begin rehabilitation in stroke. So let's talk about early physical activity. So one of the things that we're doing is we're doing a study. We're examining what's the ideal timing, type, duration, and intensity of physical activity that should be introduced to best reduce the risk of prolonged symptoms. And I'm not going to go into all the math, but in short, the patients that began physical activity earlier did better. Now again, I need to pause and make sure I am not suggesting someone go back to their tournament or their game or their contact practice. But sitting in a bed doing nothing is also perhaps just as bad with regards to getting better within the 1 month. And we published this study as well in JAMA. And because of this and other great work done by doctors in Buffalo, like Dr. Letty, in Montreal, and others, we finally started to make some changes to the guidelines. And so this is, I'm just going to briefly introduce, this is a study now that we're sending kids home with and comparing 2 different types of rest and physical activity protocols where we measure how much activity they're doing. to see if we can actually have data to prove one is better than the other. And so they finally updated the guidelines, and the parachute guidelines was updated, as well as this conference in Berlin that I was fortunate to be a part of. And what the guidelines now say is, you can begin low impact, low risk activities after about 48 to 72 hours of rest. So you still need some of that initial rest, but you can begin as tolerated. Now, if you're having problems walking straight because you're so dizzy, then you're not tolerated and you don't have to do it. But these are the things that we need to sort out. And so when we talk about getting back to their lives, these people who've had concussions need to start moving around. These are the new recommendations with goals. The goal is not necessarily to get back to playing their tournaments or playing their competitions. But some of these steps, the goals is just to start increasing your heart rate. Goal is to add your movement. So I don't want to focus on return to competition, I want to focus on return to physical activity in life. And the same thing as it pertains to school. We focus a lot about sports, and we don't talk about work and school, and those are just as important. And many people say, if you've had a concussion, you start your gas tank on a half tank a day. And if you're beginning your day with only a half tank of gas, you better prioritize what's the best way to spend your energy. And if you're a teenager, that should be in school. And therefore, one of the things that we're working on, and this is from a great website, it's called the CAT, Canadian, it's an online training tool for concussion. It's catonline.com, and they've recently updated to match the guidelines. What this talks about, and I don't expect you to read it, but what it does is it says there's different stages. So the first stage is start with light cognitive activity, and then you can move to part-time school, and then you can move to a more intensive part-time school, to then full-time school, but still with some accommodations, and then finally the same to back to regular full integrated school with full exams. And just to say, we need to focus on that. The research is so hard to do, and that has been a big challenge for us, and I admit that, because if we say, how can I measure how much you're thinking? It's so hard to measure, because even if I say lay in an MRI and don't think of anything, there are some people that may lay there and really think of nothing. And there may be other people say, oh my gosh, I wonder what's happening with my math test tomorrow. I wonder what's going to happen with this. And their mind is still going, even while they're supposed to be resting. So it's a harder studies to design, but our hope is in a few years' time, we'll be able to crack the codes on what's not only the best way to begin physical activity, but better ways to reintroduce thinking activity as well, such that everyone can get back to doing the things they want, love, and need to do. Thank you very much for all your attention.
So before we take a 10-minute break, I thought that we might give a chance to have just a couple questions from the audience, if there's any questions per se. So I'll bring it here. Maybe you can. Oh, sorry, Christian and Sean too.
The question regards to the last session there. My daughter was injured 7 years ago. We took the best advice we could at the time, and she was locked up in a dark room with no noise and no stimulation. So, would that activity have a permanent effect, or is a different protocol now going to, did that just slow it down, and will that go away if we take different action?
So, great question. The question was, did doing more rest cause harm? And I think that's a fantastic point. Thinking will not cause harm. Thinking doesn't cause brain damage. Physical activity doesn't cause brain damage. Nor will resting physically or cognitively cause brain damage. What this is, as Christian said so well before, this is a holistic problem. And we have to allow the brain to recover the gray matter stuff, but we also have to have the mind heal. And getting outside, getting moving, reintroducing that social interactions are part of that holistic healing. I don't know why it works or why it doesn't work, but it most likely has to do with some of the fact that by re-engaging into physical activity, you're releasing some neuropeptides, which increase your cerebral blood flow, which improves the healing process. But there's also the psychological part of it. If any of you run, you probably feel better after doing a good day's workout than the days that you sit around and do nothing. And that probably has something to do with it too. So there's a little bit of both. By doing nothing, it didn't mean it caused damage. It's just some of the physical activity may promote recovery.
Just add that too, just quickly. When you look at, so there's something great called neuroplasticity, right? And it's the ability for your brain to grow and continue to develop, right? And we know how exercise, we know what happens to the brain when you start exercising. We know your hippocampus, so the thing that links memories and emotion, gets bigger. It takes memories from short term to long term. Exercise actually makes it bigger, right? We know that when you exercise, you increase blood flow to the front part of your brain. The front part of your brain helps you focus and concentrate and behave, right? So to get someone that is, like Roger and Sean were saying, to get someone that has a brain injury, whether it be a concussion or stroke, we know that exercise can help. We know that shutting down and not slowly, steadily pushing in the right direction can actually be quite detrimental, but not at all irreversible.
Okay, so we'll go to the next question. If I could ask the panelists a few short answers, please.
Uh-oh.
Short. Not for a Christian. With teens coming up to their 18th birthday and being done with GEO, who do we hand off to?
Look, two people down here. The problem is, it is like, so I see some of my patients out here too, and there is a bit of a gap between, all right, and this is all in medicine too, and that's why, you know, when you transition, when do you go from pediatric to adult, right? And so it's trying to keep this short. We're trying to mainstream, we're trying to streamline the transition, but there are some people that, you know, I use in the community that we can potentially point in the right direction.
What are your thoughts on using neurofeedback as a treatment option for pediatric concussions?
So when you talk about the physiological stress, right, on how, after a head injury, right, and you look at neurofeedback. So neurofeedback, for those who don't know, it's a type of psychotherapy that looks at how the brain waves move, right? So they actually get a little EEG machine, and you can actually watch how the brain works in real time. And for instance, we know that people that have ADHD, people that have stress, they both have slow wave patterns in the front part of your brain. And by identifying those slow wave patterns, what triggers them, right, and then doing a little intervention to make them a little bit faster, you know, that you can potentially help patients with ADHD, patients with anxiety and depression. Now, unfortunately, there's not any literature that supports it in the context of pure head injury, but just because, you know, there's not that approved doesn't mean you can't do it. So a lot of patients that I see have severe, significant stress, right? And so I think the jury's still out. I think neurofeedback has some promise, but again, it's just early on. But we can talk after, because I talk too much.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Marshall. My husband suffered a traumatic brain injury in July of 2016 and was referred to the acquired brain injury program pretty much 2 months after that, and he's still on the waiting list. Do you know anything with, you know, how wait times are being reduced and if there's anything done in that regard?
Good question. I think it has to do with access, and I think, as Roger well pointed out, my main practice is minor severe brain injury, and I've been doing concussion and guideline research for some time. Yeah, I can say that we've actually made major inroads. This past summer, we've actually, the volume of consults we're now going through in our clinic has gone up by 250%. So in fact, the wait list, which is over, we're just doing projections this week, wait list is over 2 years ago, 2 years at one point, is now down into the range, I can't guarantee this, but we were just projecting numbers yesterday, probably around 6 to 8 months before we'll actually catch up at the rate we're going. So I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think it's been from drives through initiatives like this for us to reach that volume. We've had to have increased number of physicians and the resource going, but I think it's a very valid question.
In fact, we have heard the cry from the community to actually improve this, and that's one of the goals of what's happening with Sean and the others. Sorry.
I was just going to say, talk to your local MPP, get people advocates to get more resources. It's tragic that the people that need help aren't getting it.
So last question.
Hi, my name is Diane Matias. I'm the founder and CEO of SportFits. So we manufacture a device that measures, monitors, and manages concussion. And I would like to find out from you gentlemen who I would contact to do research at GEO.
So this is an interesting question because there's a lot of people out there with ideas, connections.
I think it's all, we're always looking to try to figure out what's the best way to better recognize, diagnose, and manage concussion. And if there are tools out there that can help us better do that, we're always open to hearing what those ideas are.
Great. Before the break, just one last thing. Shauna, I just wanted to give you the chance because, again, this is not just about pediatrics, it's about the whole life spectrum, which includes adults. All of you children will become adults. So I know that there's efforts going on both in terms of looking at scales and predictability and also guidelines and back to work. So is there parallels, is there differences? Just a real short question, answer, please.
I think there's parallels and there's differences. So I think that the pediatric or adolescent population, which is most vulnerable, certainly the symptom constellation experienced by adolescents and young children are similar to those experienced by adults. I think that the emphasis on return to school, often the emphasis of adults is return to work and actually life responsibilities. And unfortunately, in many adults, the two are hard to separate out. So in fact, we do see a preponderance of people who have heavy life responsibilities and saying, take back, take time and cut back is not almost impossible. So I think a lot of the work needs to be done in that area. The majority of our practice, and with adults, it's less likely to be sport-related concussion. It's more likely to be motor vehicle accident, fall, assault.
Great. Thank you so much. Let's take a 10-minute break and come back, and Tim will start the
So I promised Lee that I would keep this very short and sweet, although I did write a very nice introduction about him. Working in Boston for the year, I didn't have the opportunity to work directly with Lee, but I worked with many of his colleagues, and there's nothing but good things to say about him and his research, and I'm sure after this presentation you'll all feel the same way. He's done work at Columbia, Yale, Harvard, BU, so please put your hands together for Lee Goldstein.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. What a wonderful occasion to be here to see people in the community coming together, researchers, politicians, health providers, families. This is really a wonderful thing, and I wish you all the best of luck in continuing to do and carry this forward. It is an important mission. This is one of the leading causes of death and disability, not only here in Canada and the US, but also throughout the developing world. This is an international problem. And it also affects more than people with sports. I'm glad I came up. It particularly affects people in the lower socioeconomic strata. The homeless are severely affected. Our incarcerated populations are affected. This is only the tip of the iceberg. So let's see if we can, yes, there we go. Okay. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the relationship of concussion and TBI and this very scary disorder called chronic traumatic encephalopathy. No one can say it. I have trouble. I practice every day so that I can say it correctly, but let's just call it CTE. And this is a bona fide neurodegenerative disorder. And just like second impact syndrome is one of these catastrophic end-stage problems that can occur with these injuries, this is on the continuum. We don't know where on the continuum, but it is certainly on the continuum, and we need to understand it not only because it relates to TBI and concussion, but also because it relates to neurodegenerative diseases. So first and foremost, I'm not going to go over this, but this is a very large team, including my colleagues at the U, but my own colleagues over at Harvard, an international team that includes Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. We do a lot of biomechanics. I won't get into that here. University of Oxford and others. And I have only one disclosure, but it's not relevant here. It's with Revyon. We have funding from a variety of different places, including the Concussion Legacy Foundation. So this disease goes back, was actually first reported, this is an amazing document, it's in New York, it's called the Edwin Smith Papyrus. Of course it was stolen from Egypt, and it's given a name from the place from the stealer, not from where it was stolen. But in any case, this is the first treatise ever related to the brain. It's the first indication of pulsations of the brain, of the dura, of the cerebrospinal fluid. Amazing document. And this also was a clinical description of concussion. And I want to jump ahead now several millennia, and we have the recent Berlin consensus. And I have to say, really, from the hieroglyphics that were there before, the cuneiform, not hieroglyphics, actually, cuneiform, and the descriptions today, they're really not much different. And sadly, the treatments, as we are learning, are still very much evolving. We don't stick the finger in the hole anymore or pour honey in there, but other than that, we're still trying to learn how to figure out what this is. And I'm going to do something here that's probably a little different, very provocative. It's based on our most recent research. But I'm going to actually distinguish concussion from traumatic brain injury and traumatic brain injury from CTE. And I have some very specific reasons for doing so. And I hope you'll bear with me and not throw any stones. So I'm going to say, based on our research and some other recent findings, that concussion is a neurological syndrome that may or may not be a traumatic brain injury and is not identical with traumatic brain injury. In fact, I'm going to argue that they're actually distinct pathophysiologically. That is, they're actually caused by the same insult, but can lead down different paths and actually may be distinguishable, as I'll show you in a moment. And so concussion, I would argue here, is controversial, by the way, that is a neurological syndrome. It may or may not be related to TBI, but it is not a TBI per se. These are distinguishable. It's a neurological incident. And the disease, CTE, is actually a neurodegenerative disease. So these are apples and oranges and bricks. They're very different things, even though they may be related, and it's important to distinguish these. So part of the reason I'm going at this is because it raises the question about what is it that counts? Is it the concussion per se that is the syndrome, the neurological syndrome that we variously describe, or is it the hit? And this is a very, very important distinction because the way we approach the problem is different if we define it differently. And we're going to define it based on hard scientific evidence. So one of the reasons that brought this to our attention is we've had all of this football related stuff with the pro footballers and the hockey players, but I want to raise this case because Owen Thomas, who was died from a self-inflicted hanging incident at the age of 21, a very hard-hitting and much beloved captain of his team at the University of Pennsylvania, he had no history of concussion, not a one. He'd been hit in the head many times, but he never had a witnessed or diagnosed concussion. And yet, when we looked at the brain, Anne McKee and colleagues, my collaborator Anne McKee, we saw CTE, which are these brown lesions here, which are a tau protein that's also found in Alzheimer's disease. And it's a neurodegenerative disease in a 21-year-old. And I want to also say that even though there's only a little bit of pathology there, we have a lot of disease. He was really profoundly affected by these injuries. His grades were dropping, he was having trouble with affective control, he was depressed, he was anxious, and he wound up treating it with, by hanging himself. So this is a really big problem. So there's an inconsistency with the pathology and the disease. No concussion. So that raises, there are variants of this disorder, by the way, that look like ALS. I just want to mention this. This is Kevin Turner. This was announced last year, actually at our CTE conference in Boston. This presented this tragic case. Kevin Turner presented as a classical clinical ALS case, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. It was not. It was CTE. There's a Parkinsonian variant as well. So a lot of these diseases that look one way may actually be something else neuropathologically. So I'm not going to get into this too deeply. This is a distinct disease. It is really only found with this type of pathology, with the tau protein accumulation in the base of the sulci, which are the valleys of the brain, and very importantly, it's in and around the small blood vessels at the base there. There's no other disease like this. So when we see it, that's what it is. So we did a paper back in 2012, and this was related to military-related blasts. And this actually gave us insights into impact because we learned a lot about the biophysics here. And this actually involved the Canadian military. They all followed us foolishly into this several wars that I don't we're still involved in. We had well over 500,000 vets returning to the United States who've been exposed to blasts, many of them tens, if not hundreds of blast exposures, and they were complaining, and we believe them. I certainly believe them, and we wound up with several of these brains. This paper actually just is in the Library of Congress. This just went up today, so if you're interested in science in the classroom, we think it's a very important paper for explaining how politics and medicine kind of interact. Anyway, what we found in this, in these cases, and by the way, we compared this to the youngest cases of CTE that we had in our brain bank to date, and these were under the age of 21. So this is, think about that, neurodegenerative disease under the age of 21. So you can see, I don't know if I have a pointer here, if this works or not. Yeah, here we go. So, whoops. You can see here these brown lesions in a retired football player where we get a lot of news about them, but we also saw this in an 18-year-old football player, an amateur athlete, and a 45-year-old blast combat veteran who had been exposed to blast. And they all had the same type of unique pathology that identifies this very unusual disease. And it's around the vessels, and it's in the cortex of the brain. And this is really very surprising. We see this pattern that's very patchy. So this is not a tissue reaction, as we would say. There's something very special going on around those vessels, and I thought it had something to do with the physics, and that turned out to be true. So one of the many surprises here was that different insults, hockey, football, head banging, repetitive head banging in a case of obsessive compulsive disorder, blast exposure. The insult is not the driver. The type of insult's not the driver. It's getting hit in the head. Or having a trauma exposure that involves acceleration, deceleration. We'll get into that a little bit in a moment. So we thought that maybe, since we're getting the same pathology, maybe there's something about the physics that are causing this to be the same. And the short answer to this is that's exactly right. So to do that, we now have to turn to animals. And when we have pathology, we can do correlation, but when we do animal experimentation, we can actually find out the causal links. It's not that this correlates, A correlates with B. We can say A causes B. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort. It's not quite as sexy as some other types of science, but it is the hard evidence to say that this caused that, and we have it. And so we have an animal model that we did a little differently from other people. Big lab at BU we developed some new ways to do this. And this is what it's going to look like. You'll see this supersonic shock wave goes through. We do this with ultra high speed videography, maybe not. You'll have to take my word. There we go, there we go. So this is a million frames, this is 100,000 frames per second. We typically do it 1,000,000 frames per second. And what we saw is that the head moves very, very quickly, and that is what causes the injury. It's not the blast shock wave, it's the blast shock wind. And we think that causes, this is the movement of the head. And here's what we found when we looked at these animals with very high resolution. This is the highest resolution you can get in a state-of-the-art MRI. The brains look entirely normal. And this is the problem in the clinical realm, is that I'm going to show you these animals have very severe brain injury, but we can't see it structurally on an MRI. So that's a real problem for us clinically. So they look entirely normal. We'll take the brain out. The brain looks entirely normal. And let me just cut to the chase. It's not normal. It's way not normal. In fact, we see the same pathology that we see in the human brain, and boy, were we surprised by this. So we were not expecting this at all. We thought we were going to have to use special mice to do this, that express human proteins, and sure enough, we're the first people in the world to show that in these mice, they're not supposed to have any tau pathology, we see it. A causes B, not correlated, causally linked. And that was a big breakthrough for many of the veterans who had this blast exposure. Saying, you know, this A causes B. So we've now done subsequent work. This is a paper we published in Nature a couple of years ago with some colleagues over at Harvard. And we show that this pathology not only is induced by the blast exposure, but it actually persists, and it even progresses. And we can see it out to half a year later. So that's about a quarter of a lifetime of a mouse. We know a lot about what's going on there now, both at the cellular level and at the biochemical level. I don't need to get into that now, but I do want to bring up this idea about the problems affect control and attention and depression. We've looked in parts of the brain that control that those types of problems. That is learning and memory, cognition, attention, affect control, and we see functional damage in the exact areas of the brain that cause the clinical symptoms that you just heard about. So we've been looking there, and we find them, and they persist. And this is very concerning for us, because we thought that this one exposure would never do it. We see the behavioral problems in exactly the cognitive domains that we see in our veterans, in our sports athletes, in our kids, and our adults who are affected. The same things are affected in our mice. And again, here's the causal relationship. So we did a lot of biophysics here. I won't get into it, but I just want to say that the piece of this is very important, is it's related to head motion. Very, very tightly coupled to that. We now know a lot about that. So let me turn here briefly to what we're doing now. This is unpublished work that hopefully will be published soon. And we turn to impact, and what we learned from our blast exposure, we can now look at with respect to impact, which turned out to be a harder nut to crack. So we looked at the youngest cases that we have, and these are rare as hen's teeth, thankfully, of teenagers who had had a mild traumatic brain injury and then died of another cause in the acute, subacute period afterwards. So we had 4 cases, and we learned a lot from these cases. In fact, having this brain bank, having out of the tragedy that befalls the folks who are affected, this is how we learn, because we can only learn from what we know. And so from these tragic cases, we learned that CTE doesn't start late. It's not a late thing, it starts early. Teenage brains, soon after an exposure, they're already showing some signs of CTE pathology. And I want to show you here, this is probably one of the most famous blows in the history of boxing. I don't know if this will play, maybe it will. So this is Rocky Marciano and Jersey Joe Wolcott. And you're going to see a right, whoop, maybe not. If we're lucky enough, okay, we won't see that. What we're going to see there is not what, we're going to see a right hook going into the left part of the head, and we're going to replicate this here. And you'll see a faltering of the contralateral side of the body. It's just like a wilting like this. And he's not knocked out, all right, in the sense that he's lost consciousness, but he is certainly concussed. And you can see the neurological implications of this just like this. And we can recapitulate that in our mouse model. We've already done this in blast. We've done exactly the same thing. We get the head to move the same way without crushing the skull. This only took us 7 years to develop, but we did it. And we're able to get, if you can see this here, on one side we have blast, on the other side we have impact, and we're going to get the head to move exactly the same way. Exactly the same way, loading it in two different ways. So we've done the kinematics on this. I'm not going to bore you with it, but by and large, the head moves exactly the same way. 2 different injuries, but the same head movement. And what we're able to show here is that after blast, if we do this without anesthesia, we never see any of those neurological signs, the motor signs, or even the behavioral signs that we see after, yeah, I'm tying up. So at the end of the day, what we've found here is that we know how to look at this in living humans after these impacts. We see the blood-brain barrier is broken, and we actually have even new therapies now that we've tried in animals to do this. So I'm going to leave you with this right here, really the take-home message, which is right here. So we know from the work that we've done here is that hits correlate with CTE pathology from the neuropathology, and we know that in our animal models, that the hits cause CTEs. We can do a causal linkage here. We know that different injuries can cause the same pathology in the brain, and we know that CTE pathology starts early, not late. It's starting after some of these initial injuries, and it can progress. And we also know that concussion and TBI are actually different things. We've already started to work on new diagnostics and new therapeutics. We're already well into this. Some of these are already moving into the clinic. And I want to just re-emphasize here that the real core of this is in the clinical team, as you've just heard here earlier. You can the hits are really important. Whether you have signs and symptoms afterwards may not capture the full extent of the damage. So we need to not just focus on the concussion and the symptomatic component, but also on the hits to the head where there are not clear symptoms at all or even signs, because those are the ones that we're really going to miss. Those are the ones we're really worried about. And I thank you for your time and attention.
So next we'd like to introduce Lisa Mchale. Lisa comes to us from Tampa. She actually works on the U.S. side of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. She's the Director of Family Relations, and she just has a very compelling story about her husband, Tom. So please give us a warm welcome for Lisa.
Thanks very much. It's a bit intimidating to follow Lee, but I'm just really here to give I think the human side of the story. My late husband, Tom, played 9 years in the National Football League as an offensive lineman. In 1987, he signed as an undrafted free agent with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, where he played 6 seasons before playing 2 for Philadelphia Eagles and a final season protecting legendary Dan Marino in Don Shula's final season coaching the Miami Dolphins in 1995. Those were really good times, as you can imagine. And a very good part of our social network consisted of Tom's teammates and their wives or their girlfriends. Of course, that was a really, really long time ago. In the intervening years since then, I can recall many occasions where I've heard about or read about divorces, assaults, arrests, difficulties with gambling, drugs, addictions, and things of that nature involving former players. Nobody I knew. But I'm sure that I, perhaps like many of you, attributed it to these elitist athletes having spent a lifetime hoisted upon these pedestals, told they need not bother themselves with things like getting an education or worrying about silly rules, having difficulty coming down, and living with life once the spotlight, the celebrity, and the money are gone. Because these guys I was reading about were absolutely nothing like the players that we used to socialize, whose weddings we attended, and who spent Thanksgiving dinners with us. And they certainly were absolutely nothing like my husband. Of course, that was all before I lost the person most dear in all the world to me. It was before the world really was beginning to talk about concussions. It was before I had ever heard the term chronic traumatic encephalopathy. And it was before I understood the capacity of this disease to literally make strangers of our loved ones and to tear even the most loving of families apart. I met my husband when I was just 19 years old, as I was entering my sophomore year at Cornell University. And not surprising, I think, my first memory involving Tom occurred on a football field. As a new member, actually, of an all-female managerial staff, we were required, along with the players, to report to campus a couple of weeks before classes resumed for fall semester for 2-a-day preseason practices. And I remember very vividly standing on the field with the other managers when Liz, one of the 2 seniors on our squad, approached the rest of us. And she had in her hand one of these white towels that we always had draped around our necks. And she announced to the rest of us, "I'm going to keep this towel forever, and I'm never going to wash it, because Tom Mchale used it to wipe the sweat from his face." Now, I would imagine, looking back, that what inspired Liz's pronouncement had to be the fact that Tom, just a year or so prior, had given up a full scholarship and a starting position at the University of Maryland in order to attend Cornell's prestigious School of Hotel Administration. And it was widely anticipated that the following year he would be playing somewhere in the NFL, which admittedly, Tim, is a bit of a rarity among Ivy League players. Because Liz could not have possibly appreciated at that point, but what I was to come to learn in the ensuing years is that of all the many things that made Tom Mchale truly remarkable, the fact that he had ever played in the NFL wouldn't make my top 10. He truly was one of the really, really good guys He was bright and engaging, he was handsome, he was charming, he was principled and driven. He was a fantastic father and an even better husband. I actually recall thinking in times in my life that he seemed too good to be true. So much so that years later in our final years together, as it felt that the ground was literally crumbling from beneath us, I actually remember questioning my memories of him, whether they had been real, or whether I had somehow in some kind of a blissful infatuation been blinded to whatever faults he might have had. Years later, when when I really fully understood Dr. McKee's diagnosis, I remember telling her that she did more than help me understand what happened to the amazing man that I had been married to, but that she actually gave me back my Prince Charming. A question that is very, very often asked, but one that is very, very difficult to answer, is when did the symptoms begin? 20/20 hindsight is a very interesting thing. I do all the time think back about small incidences that might have gone on over the years and I wonder if CTE might have played a part in that. But I can tell you when I became aware, or at least Tom made me aware, that things had fundamentally changed. And that's when he confided in me one evening that he had been feeling overwhelmingly depressed and that he had been for quite some time. He told me that the pain of being on his feet all day was too great. And this from a man who literally never volunteered complaints of pain. And he told me that running the restaurants that had been his childhood dream since I can remember was no longer enjoyable. He was in his late 30s at the time. I remember being surprised. One, because I hadn't known, which meant that he was compensating awfully well. And two, because it couldn't be more contrary to his nature, which was never anything but upbeat and positive. And I remember feeling scared. Tom was the sole provider of our family of 5. I was a stay-at-home mom, full-time at home, raising 3 boys, the oldest of whom had very significant special needs as a result of his very premature birth. Treatment for the depression by a psychiatrist did not seem to bring about any discernible improvement. And in fact, in the following years, it became more and more apparent that Tom was really struggling. He had difficulty sleeping at night and couldn't engage during the day. He couldn't focus on any meaningful work. He was putting on weight, couldn't stick to exercise goals, developed a very strange affinity for things that were sweet. Might want to do some research on that, Lee. His time with the boys, coaching their teams, it seemed to become more of a chore for him rather than a joy. He began spending less and less time doing the things that he enjoyed and checked in less and less frequently with his childhood friends and with his family. He essentially was completely disengaging. To add insult to injury, Tom's doctor began treating his pain with opiate pain medication, which over time Tom began to abuse and to which he became physically dependent. This picture was starting to look a lot like all these players I had read about. But I really couldn't make any sense of how I got here. You know, it seems to me that a lot of pro athletes really have difficulty leaving the game. They often have to be kind of carted off the field, kicking and screaming for their final time. But Tom was different in the sense that he was actually looking forward to getting on to the next chapter of his life. And so with more than one offer on the table to go into what would have been his 10th season, he walked away from the game on his own accord, and as far as I could tell, with absolutely no regret. But he did have a profound appreciation for having been given the God-given ability to have played the game at its highest level for so many years, and for all of the opportunities that gave him as he began to pursue his next business pursuits. It's still surreal to me to think about the fact that a very short 12 years later, Tom was gone, dead of an accidental overdose at the age of 45. At the time of Tom's death in May of 2008, there had actually already been 4 former NFL players diagnosed with chronic traumatic encephalopathy, but neither Tom nor I were aware of any of them. I often wonder how long it would have been before I became aware of this disease had it not been for a call I received from Chris Nowinski requesting my husband's brain for scientific study. Believing him to have never suffered a concussion, I told Chris that he wasn't going to find what he was looking for. But if the intent of this research was to somehow make sports safer for future generations, I truly believe Tom would want to be a part of that. And so I consented. Naturally, I was very, very surprised by the findings. That Tom had actually had a relatively advanced stage of the disease, stage 3, with stage 4, its highest, is associated with full-blown dementia. Dr. Mchale explained to me that this is a disease that affects the areas of the brain that control impulses, decision-making, executive function, and emotions. And for the first time in a really, really, really long time, things were beginning to make sense. The following January, I participated in a press conference with the doctors to take Tom's diagnosis public, and I met the doctors for the first time the evening before over dinner, and I asked them what the implications of Tom's diagnosis was for my boys who at 8 and 10 were just beginning to play Pop Warner football. And essentially they told me, we have no idea, but we intend to find out. So about a year later, I told Chris Nowinski that I would like to help him. And thankfully, Chris said yes, and he put me in charge with working with the other families who made the donation to the brain bank. When I began working in March of 2010, there were roughly 20 brains in the brain bank, my husband's having been the 3rd just 2 years prior. Today, less than 8 years later, there are over 450 brains. The research team works very, very closely with our donor families to gather comprehensive clinical and medical histories on all of our donors, and that has led to tremendous advancements in the understanding of the clinical presentation of this disease. It has also given me great assurance that Tom had not been unique in his struggles. And it's also given me a bit of a window into what might have been in store for Tom and for our family had we not lost him at such a young age. In early January of 2014, there was a current Baltimore Ravens player, I think by the name of Ray Rice, who was caught on video dragging his fiancée out of a hotel elevator. And at that time, we received some calls from media asking whether that could be indicative, that kind of behavior, could that be indicative of CTE? And they wanted to know if they could talk with any wives of our donors who had been diagnosed with CTE, who might have experienced violence in their marriage. And I remember feeling so defensive and so immediately dismissive of the idea that CTE could cause that kind of a behavior, because I absolutely did not want to believe it ever possible that Tom could have ever been capable of any level of violence. But the reality is, as Lee says, it's a progressive disease. I know wives who have been forced to divorce their husbands only to reconcile years later, once much of the volatility had subsided. I recall a conversation with a young wife who described her fears about when she would hear the garage door going up at the end of the day because she worried that her child, their infant's colic, would set her husband off. And another young wife whose college-age daughter refused to come home for summer because she wasn't sure which father would meet her at the door. All of it makes me exceedingly, exceedingly sad. It's a devastating disease. But you know what brings me great encouragement, and what has been really, really interesting to witness over the last 9 years, is the change in the willingness of players and their families to talk openly about what they're experiencing. I have so often considered what a gift it would be for Tom and how much he deserved to know that he hadn't been alone, that there had been a neurological reason for what he was experiencing, and that it wasn't his fault. I cannot tell you how many times family members, upon hearing of their loved one's diagnosis, have said to me, I wish I had known. I wish I had known. I would have been more patient. I would have been less resentful. I would have been more compassionate. It is my hope that this increased awareness about this disease will make a world of difference for those who are currently struggling with it and their families. The problem with CTE is that a lot of the symptoms of the disease don't make our loved ones very lovable at times. But now these challenging behaviors have a name, CTE. And now that it has a name, it has less stigma attached. So now the players, their families, they can talk about it. They can seek help, they can seek support. And a big difference in my mind is now these families, these players have a much better idea of what it is that they're up against. So I thank you all for listening, for your attention, because I think these stories need to be known. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Sobering stuff. I'm going to call up, we're fortunate enough to have a number of pro athletes, both current and former, with us today. I'm going to bring up some of them to come and to participate in our panel discussion. I'd like to start with Jim Kite. Jim is a former NHL defenseman with the Winnipeg Jets, Pittsburgh Penguins, Calgary Flames, Ottawa Senators, San Jose Sharks, after being drafted 12th overall in 1982. Jim also played in Las Vegas and Kansas City with their respective IHL teams. Jim suffered a career-ending concussion as a result of a major car crash in Kansas City. And he has since pursued a career in academia and is now the Dean of the School of Hospitality and Tourism right here at Ottawa. Ernest Jackson was born in Rochester, was raised in upstate New York, making him practically Canadian. He has played in the CFL for 6 years, and after starring at the University of Buffalo. He played for the Red Blacks in 2015 and 2016, and had more than 1,000 yards receiving in both of those seasons while scoring an eye-popping 15 touchdowns. He was the runner-up for the CFL's Most Outstanding Player last year, and caught the historic game-winning touchdown in the Grey Cup last year to bring Ottawa the first Grey Cup in 40 years. Lynzee Stone is a former NCAA Division I hockey player at Rochester Institute of Technology. In her first game of her junior year, Mackenzie suffered a concussion that sidelined her for the remainder of the season. She has reported that her injury affected her ability to be a student, an athlete, and more importantly, herself. And she has served as an alternate captain during her senior season. She's from Cars, Ontario. Welcome home, Mackenzie Stone.
Cars is in the P in Carleton.
Okay. Lisa wants everybody to know that part of her writing. We're very fortunate. We've got somewhat of a surprise last-minute guest. We're joined by Jeff Keeping, who was the second-round CFL draft pick in 2005. He's played 13 seasons as an offensive lineman for the Toronto Argonauts, Mchale, and Winnipeg Blue Bombers. Jeff was a CFL All-Star in 2013 and won a Grey Cup with the Argos in 2012. He's now president of the CFL Players Association and a board member with the Empower Foundation. Welcome, Jeff. Jim, since this is your home turf, we'll start with you. Like so many other stories we heard today, your career was ended by a concussion, but ironically, you sustained the concussion not on the ice, but in a car accident. Can you tell us about the accident and what your recovery period was like?
Sure. Well, the car accident was, I had many concussions when I played, all undiagnosed. Quick story, I cross-checked Steve Eiserman from the Nepean when he was playing for Detroit, right in front of the Detroit bench.
Also Lisa's district, right?
Yeah. Yes. And I knew what I was doing, but I expected either Bob Probert or Joey Kosher to come after me, and certainly it was Joey. And we ended up getting in for an altercation, and he had a really, really heavy punch, and he hit me right here. I put my head down to take the punch, and I was out on my feet. He put a 4-inch crack in my helmet with his bare hand, and he hit me a couple more times on the way down. I played the very next night in St. Louis. I didn't miss a shift. The game was almost over, so I ended up going to the dressing room, but I played the very next night. Joey Kosher missed 2 weeks because he had a bad hand. So, but when a coach in my era, when a coach said to you, "Can you go?" I would say, "Of course I can play, coach. No problem. I can play." I had a headache for 6 weeks. I should never have been on the ice. But fast forward, I was playing in Kansas City, and I was leaving practice, and a car ran a stop sign. It T-boned me on the driver's door. It slid across the road, 3 lanes of traffic, hit the curb, and the witnesses say my car flipped down the sidewalk and roared 3 times. I woke up with the fire department cutting me out of the car, and I didn't break anything. I understand that you fracture bones in a car accident when you see it happening. However, I didn't see it happening because it happened so quickly. I just noticed something black coming at me, and it ended up turning out to be a black Lexus. And there's no damage inside the car except the passenger seat headrest was twisted 180 degrees. So they theorized that my head hit the headrest. And so I had concussions in the past, but you just played through them. But I had never had anything like I had. That happened on October 27th, 1997. And just September 6th, 1998 was the first day that I actually woke up without a headache. I just know that because I kept a diary. I was told to keep a diary with but I still deal with headaches today. However, getting up in the middle of the night and falling flat on my face, trying to go through a doorway, hitting the side of the door, my it's called proprioceptiveness. I didn't know where my body was in relation to space around me. I was a bit clumsy before, now I was really clumsy. And we had a very young family at home. I had 3 very young children. And I'm deaf. I'm actually orally deaf. I have a profound hearing loss. And things became really loud. So I could take my hearing aids out, which is something that some people can't do. So I could really tone down the loud noises and so forth. But dealing with the nauseousness, dealing with the irritability, dealing with the rage was inside me. And I say this publicly, when I speak I do it, it's not something I'm proud of, but it's the truth. And hearing Lisa's story, it really resonated with me in the sense that my wife said I was a different person. And we have 3 very young children, and my teammates came around for the first couple of weeks, 2 weeks. After a month, I never saw them. Everybody's busy in their lives, though they have to go. No one can stop for anyone else, and except for your immediate family. And so the only person that was around was my wife, and I was a jerk. I took it out on her, and verbally, certainly, and I'm not proud of the things I said to her, but thankfully she believed in the better or for worse, and she helped me get through it. So I went to go see in June I went to see Dr. James Kelly, who at that time was the foremost neurologist about concussions in 1998. I heard about James Kelly through Eric Lindros, because that's who Eric went to go see. So if Eric went, I should go too. And in June, Dr. Kelly diagnosed me with permanent post-concussion syndrome. So I was Humpty Dumpty. And I went through some neuropsych assessments, and the one assessment that I did, well, the assessment took 3 days to do it. A year later, that same assessment took me 3 hours. So I was pretty messed up. So for about 2 years, 18 months, I was recuperating and before the kid on the couch. So I forget what the question was at the beginning.
Your experience, which you actually answered quite well. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. I think what really happens, there's a lot of people a lot smarter than me in this room, but I thought that I did a little bit of research on brain theory and so forth, and I went back to school, I got my brain going again, I learned again, and I started writing for the Ottawa Citizen. I had never been a writer before. I read it for years, I read Wayne Scanlon for years, and so I put myself out there in very uncomfortable situations, and I knew what, and my opinion is when you're feeling really uncomfortable outside your social circle, outside your comfort zone, you're learning something new. And so I wanted to continue to push myself. And one of the big things I did is that, unlike Eric Lindros or some people who can make a living being in the Hall of Fame because of who they are, I was just a guy who played hockey. I'm very fortunate to have played that. I put everything that I had up that reminded me of being a hockey player away. And I cut the cord. I said, hockey is something that I did for a living, but hockey isn't who I am. And so I had to really make that distinction. And I had to move on. And there are many professional athletes. If you become a professional athlete, an elite athlete, the perseverance, the dedication, the focus, the sacrifice that you have to do to become an elite athlete, you just have to take that and channel it in a different area. And that's what I decided to do. And it wasn't easy, and it was a bit of a long road. And I made a fool of myself in front of 100,000, millions on TV, 20,000 live, and if I make a fool of myself and then in front of another 200, what's the big deal? That's the way I approach it.
Mackenzie, your concussion story and journey to recovery is compelling, and I also think should be shared. Can you share your story and what your injury was like and how you got to recovery?
Yeah, so, I'm new to this. I just want to give you guys a heads up. I have a sore throat, so if I have any embarrassing voice cracks, that's what's going on. But, so I got my concussion October 2nd, 2015. It was my first game of my junior season, so that would have been my 3rd year of university. I remember there was 5 minutes left on the clock, and I faked a pass back to the point, and I cut back really sharp, and then the other girl pretty much just body checked me in the head, and I dropped. I don't remember talking to my trainer when she came on the ice. I just remember getting back to the bench and saying I was fine to play for the last 5 minutes. I was able to play for the rest of the game. And I was lucky because my trainer told me to sit down and undress right away. Like, she just got me off the bench, which inevitably probably helped me a lot. But it was probably 30 minutes after I got hit that the adrenaline probably wore off, and I felt the full effects of the hit on my head. It almost felt like someone kind of like inflated my head with helium. Like, I felt so nauseous and dizzy. I pretty much just felt absolutely terrible. So the doctor told me to take it easy for the next few days, stay in the dark room, stay out of classes, lay low, and I did most of that stuff. I snuck off to a few classes, but I tried my best to stay in a dark room, and then the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and then it took me an entire year to fully rehabilitate my concussion. At first, when I got my concussion, I knew that it would sideline me from hockey, and that it definitely did. I wasn't able to play games. I wasn't able to go on for practices. Wasn't even cleared to go on the bike for months. And then on top of that, I wasn't cleared to go on road trips or really participate much with my team because of the effects that it would have on my head. But on top of sidelining me from hockey, I didn't realize how much a concussion would sideline me from every other aspect of my life. So my concussion also sidelined me from my academics. I was placed on the school's disability list, which was tough for me to accept. My professors were informed about my situation. I would get extended time on my tests and assignments if I needed them. I remember before my concussion, I would write a weekly summary for this one class, and it would take me probably an hour to read over the paper and type it out. And then after my concussion, it would take me an entire day to do. I would have to take breaks every 10 minutes because concentrating or looking at a screen or reading over the paper would be too much for my head to handle. So it would take me a very long time just to finish one assignment. Socially, it was probably one of the loneliest years of my life. I pretty much slept like 12 to 15 hours a day. I would take naps during the day. I was constantly exhausted. I was having a hard time just driving to the grocery store and picking items out of the store, just trying not to get nauseous and throw up at the grocery store. So a night out with the girls was kind of not in my cards, but I pretty much just had to kind of stay by myself a little bit. Just kind of being in social settings was hard on my head. It was hard to concentrate on conversations. The lights were a lot for my head to handle. Just background noise or having screens around me, I couldn't last for more than maybe like an hour. And then on the whole medical aspect of things, I was incredibly frustrated with my situation because although people tried to understand what I was going through, felt like no one actually could really understand because no one was in my position. And as much as I appreciated people trying to understand, no one really could know what I was going through. It took me about 9 months to actually receive the medical care that ended up making me fully rehabilitate. Up until then, I was feeling very helpless and hopeless with my medical situation. It felt like the doctors I was going to didn't really know what the problem was, or exactly. They would scratch the surface of my concussion, but they wouldn't be able to kind of analyze each and every part of how much it affected my entire body. So luckily for me, my mom pretty much did a ton of research in the Ottawa area for me. So when I returned home after the year, I came back and my mom had these appointments set up for me to see a vestibular therapist, which helped me rebalance my system, an optometric doctor who told me that I saw the world a little too much to the left because of my injury. I had to wear prism glasses for 2 months to not only rebalance my eyes, but get my musculoskeletal system back to being in line. And then I also saw an osteopathic doctor who helped move the blood flow better from my head to the rest of my body. And then on top of that, I also saw a concussion specialist, which helped me prioritize and helped me pick which activities I could do in each and every day so that I wouldn't overload my head and set myself back. And by slowly progressing each and every aspect of my life, I was able to come back to school. In September, I got cleared to go on the ice. I got off the disabilities list at school. And then October 2nd, 2016, I got cleared and I was able to play my senior year with my school.
It's interesting how, even tonight, but certainly in the work that we do with regard to head injury and concussion, that you hear these themes over and over again in these stories. Interesting that in terms of your recovery and your therapy, it really was a team effort in terms of your physicians. Interesting that we talk about that in the context of team sports. Ernest, maybe you can describe for us your game-winning touchdown in the Grey Cup last year, what that was like from your perspective, so all the Red Blacks fans here can relive that moment.
Yeah, that was definitely an incredible moment for me to have the winning touchdown in the Grey Cup.
as an athlete, the ultimate goal is to win a championship at whatever sport you're in, that you're playing in, and to have the opportunity to have the winning catch in the championship game is just, it was surreal. Like, to tell you how the play went, basically I had a slant route and both DBs backed off the route, and I seen the end zone and I got a little excited and I almost dropped the ball because I knew I was going to score. So I was looking for the touchdown before I caught it, and to finish there and just lay there in the end zone and the guys went up on me and congratulated me. It was just an incredible moment, like I said, and it was surreal, and to have the opportunity and have that moment in my life is great.
You'll be telling that story for the next 40 years.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Am I correct that you've never sustained a concussion on the playing field, but you had a biking accident, right?
Yes. Yeah, I had a biking injury. I was probably around the age 15. Me and my cousin, he was riding on the handlebars, or something we used to always do. He gets on the handlebars on a bike, and we had a little tradition. We passed this hill, we were riding down the hill and keep going. And one day we decided to go down the hill like always, and we didn't know they was repairing the pavement. So they dug up all the pavement up and it's just gravel. So we're flying down the hill like normal, and that's all I remember. You know, that last second coming up towards the hill, and I'm like, uh-oh, there's gravel breaking. And my cousin, he remembers the story because he said I flew over the handlebars, he fell down, I flew over him, hit my head, rolled down the hill a little bit. But he said I acted normal, I popped up, I picked him up, made sure he was okay, I walked home, we both got home. I don't remember any of this. But once we got home, and things started to come back to me, and it was scary because I couldn't identify any of my items that was at his house. Like, are you sure those my clothes? He's like, yeah, that's your clothes. And I had a hard time comprehending time. I couldn't really tell if it was PM or AM. I was struggling with that, and my body was really foggy, and my equilibrium was pretty much off. And basically, I had to call a doctor. My parents called a doctor, and they're like, you know, do the cocoon, stay in a dark room, relax. But once you gradually feel better, you know, slowly come to things, and that's what I did. But that whole moment of not knowing what was going on and not being able to comprehend what was that time, it's very scary. And for me to come back and to hear these stories and see these people come back and being able to play the game, it's incredible because these concussions are serious.
Jeff, player safety has been a focus for the Players Association since you assumed your position. Can you explain the thought process behind your focus, and are there any specific events that shaped the CFLPA's decision to make this a point of emphasis?
No, Tim, I mean, for the association, it's always been a priority, and I think it's really a credit to the people we have up on the stage now and before, the doctors, the public, the parents, whether it's concussions or all these injuries, really driving the awareness behind it has come to our level where we're trying to look after our guys and support our players the best we can. We've just made it a point of priority and tried to work hard. You know, the stuff you heard Eric before talk about the business of sport, that's a whole other animal, but when we talk about players' health, we would really like to have that outside of those conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Maybe you can share for the audience, recently was an announcement that certainly at the Concussion Legacy Foundation we're very supportive of. I know Chris Nowitzki came out publicly and applauded the announcement with regard to eliminating padded practices during the year, and then also extending an additional bye week.
Yeah, so thanks. It is it's something we've been working towards. I believe it was around a year and a half ago we had first negotiated to be able to get capped the amount of padded practices. So that was the first thing, is getting that kind of language in to where we now had a system where they could only have contact with our players a certain amount of times. And growing from that and working as we have been, not long after we had Randy Ambrosi come in as the new commissioner, we got to work right away. And it was something that was important to both parties, and we were able to negotiate and have padded practices, full contact practices, removed from the regular season schedule. So during training camp, when guys are earning their jobs and being evaluated, they still have those contact practices that are capped. But once the teams are made and guys are in season, There's no longer any more padded practices. And in addition to that, unfortunately, as the Ottawa guys have experienced this year, with our 20-week schedule, the teams have 2 bye weeks, but still with teams having multiple tenants and scheduling, it's been difficult. So you saw Ottawa have like 3 games in 11 days. And especially with football, it's just such a high collision sport, fast, strong guys, that we know when we looked at those 2 areas where we could try and reduce injury, concussion being one of those very serious ones, that if we could remove those contact padded practices, we know that was around 1/3 of our concussions were reported outside of game day. So we know that was a huge impact. And then if we added a week to season, you know, now going to 21 weeks, we now give them 3 bye weeks, and now can get more optimal scheduling, so we can give guys more time in between games, which is going to give them more rest and recuperation, and hopefully they're coming out of those games healthier, and now we know they'll go into the next game healthier.
Yeah, to Dr. Goldstein's point, it's every hit counts, and the more we can reduce that, I think the better it is for everyone. Football is the ultimate team game, and offensive line is the ultimate team position. Those guys are often considered the smartest guys on the team. We've got Brian Ramsey here with us, who's the Executive Director of the CFL Players Association. So the fact that you, Brian, and you mentioned Commissioner Randy Ambrosi are all offensive linemen, that's something to do with you guys getting this deal done?
I thought it was best looking, but I must have read the wrong report.
You definitely did.
You know what? It helps. I mean, I think it wouldn't matter position, but I think having someone in Randy's position that played the game and played for a long time, there's those conversations, the communication has increased, and that can only be a positive. And when we're talking, there's definitely that air of shared perspective. So that's gone a long way, and that's how we've been able to get some things done quick that we think are very impactful.
And some former players criticized the initiative, saying that no contact in practice would lead to poor technique and increased injury. What's your response to that?
You know, we knew there would be some pushback, but we're in these positions of leadership in sport, and you have to make those difficult decisions. And whether it's sport or anything in life, change is difficult, and it's often met with some resistance. But we truly believe in the move, and Eric talked earlier about culture, and culture is very deep-rooted in football, and it's just something where we had to make this change because we believe in the positive power of sport, and we can't have our sport drawn down by any of these negative attributes. So if we could make these changes, it was our duty to do so.
Well, that's fantastic, and again, with every hit counting, you know, for guys 10 years, 13 years, you don't need to see on their base block. And if you want to do some extra technique, there's nothing wrong with bringing your pads out and doing some work on your own if those guys felt like they needed it. Ernest, how has all this evolving information affected how current players think about head injury, and how is the topic discussed in locker rooms these days?
Nowadays, you know, guys speak about it a lot more in the locker room. It was something definitely back in the days, like I say, in high school, never talked about, you know, guys in high school, like, oh, you got to be tough guys, just shake it off. You know, guys talk about they seeing stars, they seeing double, but still staying in the game is with no awareness of, we're not knowing this is a concussion, let's advise a medical team. But nowadays, guys are talking about it. You see a guy, if he speaks of, I'm seeing double, I'm seeing stars, you know, we let someone know, or maybe you should sit out, you should talk to someone, go through the protocol. So right now, at this time and stage, the awareness is growing right now, and a lot of guys are speaking about it in the locker room.
Oh, it's great to hear. Mackenzie, you talked about how your teammates treated you different because the injury was invisible. Can you maybe comment on that a little bit more? And do you feel like an increase in people's awareness and education and around the topic? Do you feel like that is changing, that culture is changing in women's sports?
My teammates were actually like incredibly supportive about my concussion, so I was very fortunate in that respect. No one questioned whether or not I was making up my injury. Another girl on my team actually kind of went through the same thing as me at the time, so maybe that helped solidify it. But no, I was very fortunate to have teammates that really did want me to get the proper help, and as much as they wanted me and my other teammate back on the ice, they wouldn't have done anything to push us back too early or make us feel like we were letting the team down. So in that respect, I was very fortunate. I was very lucky. However, I've heard stories from other people that haven't exactly had the same situation that I did.
Jim, I saw a statistic that you fought 131 times in 979 professional hockey games. I was a big fan of yours, by the way. What needs to be done at the NHL level with regard to fighting? Is there a place in hockey for fighting?
The NHL, this isn't a popular opinion, particularly at this symposium. The NHL is professional entertainment. And until the fans stop turning away when a fight breaks out, until they start doing it, they will allow fighting to stay in the game. Should they be ejected immediately? That's a question for the league. It's part of their brand. When you watch a commercial on TV, they talk about the physicality of the game. Fighting, I was never a fan of gratuitous violence. Two tough guys, two nuclear weapons on each bench that play 2-3 minutes a game, and they go out and they just look at each other and say, hey, you want to go? And there's no reason to, because they just think it's their job. So I think that should be legislated or out of the game, and for the most part it has been. You need to be able to be a player first and a fight, and a person with the ability to fight second. In the past, there was, in my era, there was if you could fight and you weren't that great for skating, don't worry, we'll work on your skating. Because there's only a couple of things you can't teach at that level, and that is the innate ability to score goals and the ability to be tough. You can't teach someone to be tough. You either are or you're not. Now that is being phased out of the game for the most part. The big guys are gone. You need to be a player first. And with the referees and the suspensions and the focus on head injuries is great. Fighting in the game is going to stay. I certainly think if there shouldn't be any fighting in junior hockey. I don't think there should be any fighting in minor hockey. They should be ejected. The NHL, because it is a professional entertainment, professional sport, I think it would be a big decision for the owners to do that. They need to be brave to take it out of the game. I don't know if that courage is at the table. I'd love to be able to see it happen in the American League first, see what happens there. And I think what the easiest way to do it, and it's not popular with the Players Association, is to reduce the number of players that can play in the game. Right now, 20 players can play in the game, and if you remove 2 skaters from it, that means you only have, you have to make a decision on who those players are going to be, and if it's someone who has a physical element to them, they need to be able to be a good player. So, you know, that costs jobs in the NHL, and I'm not going to go over well with the PA. It's a tough decision. I played 17 years of pro sport. Played professional hockey. Fighting is something that I brought to the game, but it wasn't my primary reason why I was there. But I did have to defend my teammates, and it's one of the reasons why I was able to stay in the game is because I was a team player and I made sure that I knew what my role was. Whether I was a top 3 defenseman, I was never a top 2, or going back to a number 8 and going back up to top 3, 4. But that was something that was part of my repertoire of skills. And that is disappearing from the game. And if you go to an NHL, I've been to a few games this year, and it's very fast, it's very, it's very skillful, and I almost think to be honest, I think it's a very high-skilled shinny game. That's my opinion. It's shinny. There's not that much physicality in the game anymore, and but that is a different game, and it's very skillful and it's beautiful to watch. But the physicality is missing. it's just different. It's just not the same. I just came from a different area.
And have your kids participated in sports like soccer and hockey and football growing up?
Oh, absolutely. Sport is critical in an upbringing of a child. There's so many things that you learn. I'm a product of team. I played lacrosse, I played baseball, I played soccer, I played hockey. My kids played lacrosse, they played hockey. They played hockey until they were 14, and they discovered girls were snowboarding. So they retired from hockey, but they're in their 20s now, and but they learned so many things from sport, whether accountability and playing your role and being able to collaborate. And I think there's so many valuable things that you learn by participating in sport that overflow. It's a self-confidence builder in children that overflow back into your lives and in your work today. The reason why I'm in the position today is because I know how to build a team and relate with people, like players, and that has benefited me greatly from my experience, and I hope my kids get that as well.
Mackenzie, same question. Do you encourage young women to play sports like soccer, rugby, lacrosse?
Yeah, definitely. Just like it was said several times tonight, sports are definitely important to implement a lot of characteristics that can be instilled in sports, but can also be carried on into different areas of any part of life. It's definitely important to be aware of prevention and like having trainers and coaches recognize like symptoms of concussions and taking that into account, but I don't think that it would have anything to do with just absolutely getting rid of athletics as a whole.
Ernest, you also have a young son on the way. Question for you, are you going to want him to play football as he grows up?
Yeah, definitely. Like they both said, they hit the nail, hit the head right on the, hit the nail right on the head. I'm backwards right now, but I'm definitely I definitely let my son play sports, as long as there's some type of awareness going on. They're informed teams growing up about concussions, and like they said, there's so many different things sports can relate to different aspects of life, and it really helps out. So definitely, yes.
Jeff, roughly same question. Lots of positive developments at the pro level. What's going to be your advice for minor football players in Canada?
Yeah, I mean, minor football players, I have 3 young boys, 4.5, 21 months and 6 weeks. So, hands full. But yeah, I truly believe that the positive power of sport is just too much to turn away from. So I think I'm very optimistic and thankful for the medical professionals that we have here in Canada working so hard, for the great advocates that are driving awareness, and I think we just need to keep pushing our leaders in sport to make the proper changes and do everything they can do in their power so that we reduce risk and that we can focus on those positive power sport aspects that I think everyone believes so much in.
I'd like to jump in though. When I coach my own kids, and maybe because of my own experience, I was very careful whenever I saw one of my teammates, my players or my kids ever take a hit to the head. Even if the trainer said you're good to go, and they said no, they're going to sit down for a while. So I was a little bit, because of my own experience, much more cognizant and aware, and I wanted to ensure that no one was going to get hurt. That hockey is a physical game, and even if I go back to Pat LaFontaine. Pat LaFontaine is the Hall of Fame. His career was ended because he ran into his own teammate at center ice when he was playing for the New York Rangers. He ran into Mike Keane. One was looking the other way, they weren't looking in the right direction, and they ran into each other. So whenever you're going to be in the proximity of anybody, whether you're playing sport or not, you can have accidents.
So I want to thank the panel, and also want to thank we've had tremendous support from the professional athlete community, and we have a number of them with us today, which I'd just quickly like to recognize. Is Connor Williams still here from the Red Blacks? Jennifer Schneider with us, who is a brain donor for the Concussion Legacy Foundation. Al Sharon, who had 76 caps internationally, was the former captain of the national rugby team for Canada. Pat Fleming here, my former teammate from the Renegades back in the bad old days. Pat was our punter. Pat's here. I mentioned Brian Ramsey, Executive Director of the CFL Players Association, who's been instrumental in some of the progress that the PA has made. Welcome, Brian. We also have Jed Tommy here, former Tie Cat and Rough Rider. Jed, there's tremendous research and treatment being done here in Ottawa. You guys should feel proud. This truly is an international center. I want to thank Drs. Goulet and Marshall, Dr. Zemek, and Dr. Park for their presentations here today. Thanks to Dr. Goldstein and to Lisa Mchale for coming up, making the trip and sharing your work with us and sharing your story. Critical stuff as we try to make smart decisions for sport going forward. Thank you to Lisa for your continued support, and thank you to Gord, Kathleen, and Cassie. We'll continue to follow your lead. You continue to be inspiring. And finally, thanks to everyone for showing up. Just by showing up, you've made sports safer in Ottawa today. So give yourselves a big round of applause.
I'm just going to end the evening by echoing what Tim said and thanking all of you for coming. I think this evening you had a wide perspective from tragedy and the positives that can come from it, perspectives of research and clinicians, perspective of people who actually suffer from concussion and the effects of concussions, and the loved ones that have to experience it along with them. Just want to leave you with one note and one thought, and that's the following. The mind is really looked through and focused by the lens of the brain. They are inseparable. So both are at the same time incredibly fragile and incredibly resilient. And we know why it can be one or the other. What we don't know is why it goes from one to the other. Why is it fragile in one instance and resilient in another? So the final thought is no guilt. Cherish your brain, protect your brain, and above all, let's work together to understand our brains. So thank you again, and let's see each other next year.